Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is another spine-tingling tale from the incredible CreepyAus. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR? And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled I got lost in the bush when I was 8. I think I've started remembering what happened. Let's get straight into that. It's been over 20 years since I got lost on a family camping trip, and for all of them, that time in my life has been a complete blank. Or that is, until a few months ago. A few months ago? Well, to explain that, I have to first go back to 1997. When I was a little kid, we lived in Tasmania for a long while. Even now the island state is one of the least populated and wildest in Australia. But back in the 90s, that statement carried even more truth. Hobart had yet to undergo the rapid growth of the last decade or so. The wine industry hadn't exploded yet, and it hadn't quite kicked off as a destination for tourists yet either. In 1997, Tasmania was a pretty, sleepy, rugged green gem full of wild mystery, and my dad made it his unofficial mission to explore as much of that as he could. He and Mum used to go on week-long hikes through the wilderness, trekking into places that might never have been seen by human eyes. And of course, when I came along, they had to seriously cut back. But no matter how beautiful the bush might be, it's not the place for a young baby, especially in a part of the country where the temperature can suddenly drop below zero, even in the middle of January. Well, they still hiked with me in a carrier on Dad's back, but they never stayed out with me there. The most they could manage until I turned 6 or 7 were some weekend trips, when I spent the time eating ice cream and watching Disney movies with my grandparents. It must have been early 1996 by the time they were willing to take me with them. They still stuck to short trips, but I wasn't the type of kid to wander off, and their confidence slowly grew. Until November of 1997, when I went missing. We had driven up to Stanley for a short 4 or 5 day break. They took me up to the famous Nut on the first day, and then early next morning we drove to a trailhead in the Tarkine wilderness for a relatively simple 3-day hike. I was young and I don't remember a lot, but they always told me that I wandered off while they were setting up camp on the second day. I had never once done anything like that in all of our time out in the bush. Dad could never understand it, but I suppose parents sometimes just don't want to face the truth of it, which seemed to be that they had a lapse in concentration and let me out of their sight. That's not to criticize them in any way either. Kids will be kids, and I certainly never blamed them for any of it. And besides, everything turned out okay in the end. Or so I thought for 20-odd years, anyway. I must admit that there has always been an element of mystery surrounding how I came to be rescued. All told, I'd been missing for 5 days when I wandered into a clearing where an older couple had set up their caravan. A child surviving 5 full days in the wilderness, though heavy rain and single-figure temperatures is rare, but not unheard of, and not what makes my story strange. No. The weirdness kicks in when you consider that the campsite I had wandered into was close to the Savage River National Park, some 80 kilometers or more from where I went missing. And somehow, an 8-year-old girl had managed to cross that distance in 5 days, at times through heavy rain and nocturnal temperatures below 5 degrees, without food or water, and in some of the most unspoilt and rugged wilderness in the world. And stranger still, I showed no signs of exposure, no signs of dehydration or hunger. My clothes were a little dirty, but I could have just walked straight out of my house, they said. I also had absolutely no memory of the time that I'd been missing. And when I saw the old couple, I apparently said, "Excuse me, have you seen my mummy or daddy? Oh, they were just over there, but now I can't see them." And the police basically said they had two leading theories. Either I had been taken in by someone who didn't want to be found, maybe an illegal hunter or trapper, and delivered to safety in secret. Or I had been snatched by someone who had a change of mind for whatever reason. Neither line of investigation ever led to anywhere in my knowledge, and my parents hardly cared. They had me back. My parents stopped hiking until I grew up. I suppose they were protective of me, which is understandable. Even when they went back into the bush, they said they didn't have the same feeling anymore. Dad eventually took a job in Canberra when I was 15, and we moved away from the rugged country that he once loved so much. On the other hand, I grew up with the affinity for the wilderness, and once I turned 16 and had a bit of sense, I spent a bunch of time hiking around Canberra and sometimes the south coast or snowy mountains. It's no tycoon, but I still enjoyed it. Eventually, though, I went to uni. I had boyfriends and I got a job. And I didn't have time to spare trekking through the bush. I also spent 5 years trying to remember what happened to me over those 5 days. And beyond curiosity and the frustration of not remembering, I couldn't help but feel it was important for me to remember for some other reason. One I couldn't quite grasp. I tried everything, up to and including hypnosis, to no avail. After a while, I just accepted that it will always be a mystery. I didn't even think about my dreams, honestly. I've never really remembered one. I mean, I get snatches here and there, obviously, but I genuinely never made the connection. I had always had nightmares like a normal person, but I never remembered anything more than the emotion that they created. Late last year, that changed. It happened completely by accident. I had been having trouble sleeping. I had been sleepwalking, and I kept waking up at odd hours and being unable to get back to sleep. And so my therapist suggested a sleep diary. I started out by writing it down, but that meant turning on the light in the middle of the night, which honestly disrupted my sleep as much as whatever underlying issue I might have had. And so, instead, I started recording it on my phone. And that's how I discovered that, late at night and half awake, I could recount my dreams for a few moments before my brain fully kicked into gear and they were gone. The first time I heard myself talking about a dream, I actually felt quite excited. I sort of felt like I'd been missing out, and now I might at least get some insight into what I dreamt about. Even the nightmares I talked about intrigued me. That is, until I had the nightmare about the forest. That recording and a couple since set me on a terrifying path that I should never have started down. But I did, and I can't change that. And I'm sorry. Sleep recording 36. It's, I don't know, 3 something in the morning? I can't see the numbers on the clock properly. I had another nightmare about some kind of forest this time, but it was like no forest I've ever seen. I don't know if everything was huge or if I shrank somehow. The ground was covered in this thick red moss and the air smelled sweet, but not a nice sweet. Rank sweet, like spoiled meat. The sky was dark, but there was light, which didn't make any sense. Even the trees were strange. They were so tall, all gnarly and twisted, and the leaves were an odd colour, like a eucalypt but with a touch of purple. And, as I looked at the trees, I noticed that the shadows underneath them were moving, like smoke or something. I was suddenly terrified. I felt like the darkness was full of eyes, watching me, and they weren't friendly. I turned and ran, and I could have sworn I heard something behind me, whispering, almost following me. And then I tripped and fell into the moss. It was wet and spongy. I pulled my hands away and realized that the moss wasn't red. It was soaked with something red. I think blood. Lying in the moss, I could see it was writhing with creatures of some kind. I couldn't make them out, but the mats of moss moved with them. A shadow then fell over me, and I turned around and I saw... I'm not sure what it was, but I screamed, and that's when I woke up. Normally, my descriptions of nightmares didn't affect me at all, but this one, felt different. It's like it jarred loose a memory inside of me somehow. I remembered the moss, and not just from the dream either. I remembered how it felt, kind of sticky, and I remembered the smell. It was just a flash, but I knew it wasn't a snippet of a dream, or at least not a normal dream. More than anything, I remembered terror. More than the terror of a nightmare. Real, gut-wrenching terror like I had never felt before, yet somehow familiar. I had no doubt that nightmare had been more than a nightmare. And I started to wonder if it had anything to do with my disappearance as a child. It certainly wasn't anything that I remembered otherwise. I mentioned it to my therapist, although I left out the really weird stuff. She frowned as I spoke, especially when I talked about how I somehow felt like it must have been real. And then she talked about something called dissociative memory. Basically, she talked about how repressed memories are more complex than just being memories that our brain tries to make us forget. Instead of being forced down below the surface, like the movies would have you believe, traumatic memories at a young age are often recorded by our brain in flashes and snippets, pieces of imagery or emotion that are more like chopped up pieces of a film than a proper memory. Add years to the equation and they start to feel distant, unreal, and even if you do remember them, these memories can feel like dreams. And not only that, but they can bubble up as dreams during times of stress, fatigue, or intense brain activity. She wondered whether my dream had in fact been a dissociative memory. Given what I had left out, the thought made me feel slightly sick. She made me promise to mention it if I had any other similar dreams, and a few weeks later, I did. Sleep Journal 51. It happened again. It's 4:43 in the morning and I'm awake and don't know if I'll be able to go back to sleep. I dreamt about the forest again, the blood forest, but this time, it was even worse. I was in the forest, surrounded by the trees. They were even bigger up close. They looked as wide as a building. Even though I think I was little again, they must still have been bigger than any trees I'd ever seen. Or maybe they aren't. Maybe I've seen those exact trees before. Anyway, this time I was huddled under a tree root or something. I was hiding, but from what, I'm not sure. I just knew that there was a monster out there and I had to hide. The ground underneath me was just dirt, no moss, and I could see all of the creeping, crawling things moving in and out of the moss in front of where I was hiding. They had so many legs, like a whole bunch of millipedes and centipedes, but they were the size of snakes. The moss itself was so much thicker than I looked from the top, thicker than I was tall, and the crawling things scuppered around underneath it. The red fluid, the blood, soaked all the way through. All around me there was a whispering sound, but loud. It felt like hundreds of people whispering right into my ear, but there was no one anywhere nearby, and they weren't speaking any language I'd ever heard. And then something moved outside of my hidey hole. I couldn't make out any details. My eyes were too full of tears and too blurry from being rubbed, but it was big. Not a natural animal. I could see it move, but I couldn't make out the shape. I just knew that it was big, and I had to stay hidden from it. I wonder if that was a thing I almost saw in the last dream, that stood over me when I fell. It didn't feel like much time had passed, but I can't explain why. The shadow thing across the way seemed to be looking for something, looking for me. And suddenly it turned. I could see it properly still, but I knew it was looking right at me. It was like I could feel it looking at me. I moved across the clearing and into the trees slowly, but with purpose, heading straight for me. I huddled into the dirt, but I knew it would do no good. Behind me, or maybe to my right, something else moved. I turned to look and I saw a woman. She was naked and she was covered in a red fluid that saturated the moss. And she didn't look quite right. Somehow, like her face, like it was off or something. Then she pounced, snatching my right arm and dragging me under the moss with all of the crawling things, and I woke up. I can't explain why I did what I did next. I suppose I had a burning need to know what had happened. To know whether the dreams were just dreams, or if they were real, or what it all meant. And so, after a few more sessions about dissociative memory and another failed effort of hypnotism, I decided I had to take action. I had to go back to the Tarkin and try to find whatever I had found as an 8-year-old. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The wicked scout. Let's get straight into that. When I was little, my grandfather used to tell me stories, like any grandparent does, I suppose. In my case, Grandpa would tell me the stories that had been passed down through his tribe. My grandfather was of indigenous descent, and thanks to shattering effects of the extermination program run by the European settlers, he held a place of esteem within his tribe despite not being pure Aboriginal blood. He died just after I finished high school. We had moved him near us by then, and thankfully that meant I could spend time with him before he passed. And during one of my visits, he told me a story he'd never told me before. I never knew why he chose to tell me this one, so out of place with our mythology, but on the flight back to Tasmania, it snuck back into my mind. "Caitlin," he started, "these stories I've told you, they are your heritage, your history. And there are strange things in this land, and those stories try and tell us where those strange things come from. They aren't really real, but they tell us about the land and the people we come from in a way we can easily accept. That isn't to say that our spirits and our demons aren't real. You understand. Just that the stories have been fashioned around them to teach us." He paused, eyes wet and his arthritic hands trembled. "There is another story I should have told you long ago, but it's dark and evil, and I was too afraid of what you might learn from it. A story that is real, and maybe it can teach you something one day. Our people have been here for thousands of years, longer than the scientists and the history books will tell you, and longer than we can put into words. Our people have been here since a time when this world was much different, when spirits were far more than myth or legend. Way back in these times, before history even began, our people arrived and began to explore their new home. One elder led his people across a vast body of water and into a thick, dark forest, where they found plentiful food and water. And they settled there, hunting the wallabies and the kangaroos, fishing the rivers and harvesting the bounty of the bush. And many years later, the old elder had passed away, and his sons had been gone too, and the tribe had become restless. A new leader stood in their place, a warrior, still young and strong, but he lacked the wisdom of the previous elders. A medicine man tried to counsel the young elder, but he was headstrong and refused to listen. The tribe suffered as a result. Hunting parties returned with less food, and the harvesters could find only meager crops in the wild bush, and even the fish seemed to be able to slip the nets and traps. The medicine man tried again, but the young elder laughed him off. He said that the animals were becoming more secretive, more scarce, because they had grown wary of people and retreated further into the wilderness. He said that if they pushed further into the forest, into the mountains, they would find more prey. Upon hearing this, the medicine man shook his head. "You are a fool," he said, "but it is the foolishness of youth." He commanded the young elder to sit and listen to a story about the mountains and about the elders who came before him. He told a story of their first elder and how he had woken one night to the sound of whispers. The fire had fallen to a meager glow, and across the camp he saw something looking back at him with two large eyes. The whispering came from all around and even inside of him somehow, and the eyes across the camp seemed to stare straight into his spirit. The darkness shifted and turned away, and the elder felt compelled to follow. How long he followed for, he did not know. The thing he was following hovered just at the edge of his sight, taking him past landmarks that were alien and unfamiliar. All around him he heard the whispering. But more than that, he heard sounds of life like he had never heard before. The ground crawled with long, many-legged insects, larger than any he had encountered. Above him, the sound of huge wings drew his eyes upwards, where he saw bats as large as a man feasting on fireflies the size of a small bird. Or even the trees began to look different, huge and knotted, twisted in ways that seemed unnatural. The elder walked for hours, until he came to a small stone clearing, where the thing before him had stopped. The elder slowly made his way into the clearing, and before his eyes stood something otherworldly, fantastic and terrifying at the same time. He could clearly see the thing he had been following under the light of a pale moon, much larger than it should have been. The creature stood large and tall, far taller than a man, and on its head were 4 twisted horns. Thick, long fur covered it from head to toe, giving it a formless appearance, and it seemed to move on 4 legs like some of the beasts they had left behind on the plains across the sea. As the elder made his way closer, it followed him with his huge black eyes, watery in the moonlight. He suddenly noticed that the land around him had gone quiet, and then the creature spoke. It spoke inside his head and told him that he had come to a sacred place. It said that his people had wandered into a world they could not understand, and that it would destroy them all. The elder shrank with fear and asked the creature what it would have him do. He could not, after all, convince his people to leave such a fertile and hospitable place. The creature replied that his people had taken things that did not belong to them, and that if they did not stop, they too would die. The elder, frightened but fiercely loyal to his people, thought for a moment. He asked the creature if the land on which they had set up their camp belonged to it, and it replied that it did not. It stated that it could keep them safe as long as they avoided the mountains. That, it said, was where the old things lived. The elder asked what the old things were, but the creature told him he could not possibly understand.
They are not of your world,
it told him.
but they will pass through from time to time.
And do you speak for them? The elder asked. The creature replied that it was of the old things. The elder asked what price he must pay to keep his people safe in these lands, and the creature fell silent for a moment.
You must never enter the mountains,
It said.
but that is not all. At the time of the blood moon, you must organize a hunt. You will send 6 hunters, your finest, into the woods when the moon is highest in the sky.
A hunt? The elder said. For what? The creature laughed inside his head.
They will not be the hunters,
It replied.
they will be the hunted. Of 6, 1 will not return, his existence forgotten by this world. In this way, the old things will be satiated.
With this, the creature began to sink into the ground, absorbed by the very earth itself. As it did, it spoke one last time. Remember this, elder. When the blood moon is highest, 6 must enter the forest. If they do not, one way or another, the old things will take their due. When the elder finally made it back to camp the next morning, his people were stunned. He had been missing for 9 nights. The medicine man paused. Here, and looking at the young warrior, in this way, he said, our people have been kept safe. The old things are preparing us for the hunt, ensuring we are keen and hungry. The blood moon will come, and we must send the hunters. The young elder, stubborn and brave, scoffed at the medicine man. Where is this creature? He exclaimed. I will take the hunters, and we will hunt it. The medicine man shook his head. You will kill us all, he said. But the young warrior would not listen. He assembled the warriors and the hunters of the tribe and marched them into the forest, into the mountains. They walked for a full day and into the night, longer than it should have taken to get to the mountains, and some of the men began to feel uneasy. This is wrong, they said. The spirits of this land are misdirecting us. But the young warrior would not be swayed and kept his men walking well into the night. When they finally reached the mountains, the men were seized by a feeling of terror. Around them, voices from all angles, whispering through the thick trees, words that none of them could understand. They tried to turn back, but the young warrior still would not be dissuaded, and he drove them forward. All around them, there were many-legged creatures, crawling and writhing through the brush. They became aware of shadows shifting under the trees, of eyes watching them intently. In the distance, a tree lifted up and slammed back to the earth. No, not a tree. A leg. A leg the size of a tree. A voice filled their heads, and then,
You should not be here,
it said.
For there are things here of which you cannot even conceive.
The young warrior turned and saw the creature described in the story the medicine man had told him. The sight of it filled him with fear, but it was the sense of it that broke him, cold and uncaring, as though he and his hunters were as insignificant as the tiny flies that filled the forests in spring. He began to run. At the same moment, the shifting shadows came spilling out from under the trees and set upon his men, devouring each and every one of them. He ran, and the whispering followed him, through the forest and the writhing shadows. He ran through the streams and swam over rivers. He ran until the skin flayed of the soles of his feet, and still he ran. Eventually, the young warrior saw the sun and stumbled into the safety of the camp, except he wasn't safe. As he reached the center of the camp, he became aware of the silence. Nothing stirred, and nobody greeted him. He cast his eyes left and then right, dread filling him as he realized why. All around the camp, his people hung from the trees. Their blood ran from their feet, staining the ground, and they had been hung from their necks by their entrails. Unable to bear the sight, the young elder fell to the ground and wept. After some time, he began to hear whispering all around him. He welcomed it, knowing that the creature had come to ensure he shared his people's fate. As it entered the clearing, the young warrior stood to face his death, but it didn't come. Instead, the creature spoke again.
These people were yours,
it said.
They were under your protection. Your forebears made a promise, and they honored the old things and upheld it. Now that promise has been broken, and the old things have taken their due, as they too had promised.
And what of me? The young man screamed. You are surely here to kill me, too, so get it over with. The creature did not respond for the longest of times.
I am not here to kill you,
it said.
I am here to do far worse.
The man trembled at those words, unable to find a response of his own.
You will not die today,
the creature continued.
In fact, you will not die at all. The old things do not suffer a broken pact lightly. By their will, you will walk this world forever, tied both to it and to the world that waits beyond the door, bound to follow the door wherever it may open, never wholly within this world or the one beyond.
The creature then spoke a spell, words that the young elder could not understand, and began to sink once again into the earth. The young elder realized that his wounds had healed, and that he was no longer hungry or thirsty, and he fell to the ground once more and wept. With this gruesome story finished, my grandfather gripped my hand firmly. It was unlike any indigenous myth I'd ever heard, so alien that I thought it must have come from a completely different culture. The story is older than our people. The warrior led his tribe into doom, and no more made the journey across the water for thousands of years. And when they did, the warrior was there, waiting. We call that cursed warrior Maram. It means wicked scout, loosely, in an ancient dialect that died when they wiped out our people. He is the precursor to the appearance of the doorway, and he brings nothing but pain. Wherever Maram goes, you will find the door. Remember that, Caitlin. A few days later, he passed away. I always wonder why it had been so important to him to tell me that story before he went. Why it mattered so much to him that I remembered Maram and the door. On the flight to Hobart, though, I thought of the story and how elements of it matched my dreams. The many-legged creatures, the whispering, the lost time, the trees. It felt so relevant, and my grandfather's telling of the tale had been so pointed that it felt like it had to be related. But how? I thought about what it told me, but I had no idea what it truly meant. If I had, I think I would have turned around and flown straight back home. If I could have, I'm not sure I could have. Something seemed to be waking up inside my mind, and I don't know if I could have resisted it, even if I wanted to. I landed in Hobart with only the barest idea of where to look next. I needed to find someone who could tell me more about the door and the wicked scout that came before it. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. A trapper on the noose. Let's get straight into that. I've been back in Hobart for a few days, trying to find someone to talk to me about the Maram with zero luck. The local indigenous historians and community elders I contacted either had no idea or wouldn't talk to me. I was getting nowhere fast and very frustrated by it, and so I decided to contact an old friend and see if he could help me, even if that meant just bouncing ideas across the table over a coffee. Nathaniel had always been the quiet kid who lived up the street ever since I could remember. We grew up together, went through primary school together, and would probably have gone through all of high school together if we hadn't moved away. Social media kept us barely connected, but we had only spoken rarely over the last 5 years or so. He'd been a somewhat strange kid, curious and with a never-ending imagination. My disappearance fascinated him, and I knew he had all sorts of strange ideas and theories when we were growing up. He stopped all of that when I opened up to him as a young teenager about how hard I found it, being the kid with the childhood trauma, but never really knowing what or why. Still, I thought he might have a different perspective to me, and it would be nice to catch up and focus on something else for a while, anyway. He agreed, but with his work he couldn't get away long enough for a couple of days, and so we planned to meet up in a little bar he knew down by Salamanca that evening. He had grown taller than I remembered, more athletic, but he still had the same sharp eyes and goofy smile. We ordered a glass of wine and sat down on a quietish table outside, and caught up for a while. And eventually, the conversation turned to my reason for coming back after so many years. I told him everything about my dreams, a dissociative memory, my grandfather, Maram and the door, and my need to find out what really happened 20 years ago. I told him I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me work it all out, and I thought of him first. Nathaniel listened intently, smiled when I finished, and got up to order a bottle of wine before returning to the table with the sun setting all around us. He poured us both a glass and then sat back for a moment, thinking. You weren't the only one who disappeared around that time, Caitlin. What do you mean? Well, you know how I used to be obsessed with stuff like that, right? When you moved away, I kind of took it back up again. While you were here, I kept my curiosity focused on other stuff so that I didn't upset you. But once you were gone, I think I just naturally gravitated back to it. Anyway, I eventually found that there were more disappearances in that area around the same time. 6 of them over a 6-month period, which is much higher than the average. People do go missing in the bush all the time, but not that many, and not that regularly. 7 people went missing in those 6 months, and once we take you into account, only 1 ever came back. Oh my God! For whatever reason, you came back when the others didn't. I did some digging, basic stuff obviously, but it seemed like the only connection was the area. I've even spoke to some relatives of 2 of the missing, but they couldn't really point me towards anything concrete. I know you're right though. I know there's more to this than just a little girl wandering off into the bush. But what could it be? I have no idea, but I have a good reason to suspect something bizarre. He pulled out his phone, typed at the screen for a few moments, and then placed it on the table in front of me. Your story, and the blood moon. You went missing in the first week of November. The others went missing over the rest of the 6-month period that started from there. 2 weeks before you went missing in September, when there was a total lunar eclipse. Holy shit. Maybe it's not related, but when did you start having trouble sleeping? Not when you noticed the nightmares. I think it's clear they started before that, and it might be why you had so much of a problem sleeping. Last winter sometime, I think. Maybe around August? I went for a little while before. I brought it up with the therapist. But I know I started my sleep diary in September. Oh fuck, you don't mean 27th of July. The longest lasting lunar eclipse so far this century. I got up early. I watched it setting. I took crappy photos of it. You don't think that somehow that set something off in my mind? Oh, I'm not sure, but it's a decent coincidence. I gulped my wine and held it out for a refill, floored by the synergy of it. The story of Maram placed a genuine significance on a blood moon, a name we've given a lunar eclipse for ages, and I've gone missing 2 weeks after an eclipse. I'd potentially started having my nightmares, or dissociative memories, or whatever they were, after witnessing a lunar eclipse. That couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Nathaniel had this intense look in his eyes, concern mixed with excitement. His natural curiosity had never left him, and in the time it took to drink 2 glasses of wine, we rekindled all of the mystery around my original disappearance. Nate, this is crazy. Maybe I'm just going out of my mind, but it feels like there's really something to this. I've got this, I don't know, this sense that went off when I remembered the story. And it's going off now. I just feel like this stuff is at least taking me in the right direction. I have someone I want you to talk to, if you're up for it. I nodded quickly. Well, of course, I need to get to the bottom of this. I took another big gulp of wine, which didn't help my spinning head. Nate, will you help me with this? If you can. If you have the time, I mean. He grinned that goofy grin. I'm shocked you even have to ask. We raised a glass and laughed, but behind the smile and a sense of relief that I would have someone else along for the ride, my stomach churned. Even then, I knew that I was about to start down a road that I wasn't sure I should be travelling. The weekend came and Nate's workload eased off completely. His project had been delivered and he'd taken some time off to help me with a search for answers. We met up at my hotel early on Saturday morning, piling far too much stuff into his car and setting off to meet with the man Nate wanted me to see. Mark Rutherford lived on an acreage in practically the middle of nowhere, his old weatherboard house backing onto the forests and lakes of the Great Western Tiers. As we pulled up, we were greeted by an exuberant and friendly German shepherd whose excited yips summoned a great-haired man from the house. Nate described him as a historian of weird things, and his appearance suddenly fit the bill. He looked academic, bookish with thick glasses, but his grey hair hung loose and long around his shoulders, giving him a bit of a mad scientist vibe. He had a wide, welcoming smile, though, and he greeted us warmly. Nathaniel, it's good to see you again, lad. You must be Caitlin. It's an honour to meet you at last. He ushered us inside and directed us to sit on one of 4 armchairs scattered around a table piled high with papers and books. Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee? Beer? It's the weekend. I won't judge. We both settled for coffee, and Mark joined us in the lounge room. So, what can I do for you this time, Nate? I think I can guess at some of it, given who you've brought to see me. But let's start with the basics. Well, we talked about Caitlin's disappearance before, and the others at the same sort of time. But there's more now. Mark raised an eyebrow, and Nate gestured at me. I think I might have started to remember some of the things about what happened to me. Mark expelled a breath in surprise, or maybe satisfaction, and sank back into his chair, assuming a kind of pose a therapist might. I told him everything I told Nate, including the stuff about the eclipses, while he listened intently. When I finished, he took off his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully on his shirt. Wow, there's a lot there, honestly. Where do we begin? He closed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose, collecting his thoughts. Okay, let's start with some background. Generic stuff. Tasmania has always been different to the rest of Australia somehow. There are places all over the country where strange things happen, but in Tasmania it's an undeniable hotspot. We've got it all. The most famous UFO event in the country at Kettering. Thousands of ghost stories, strange creatures, strange places like the Southwest Wilderness. And that's just scratching the surface. And of course, disappearances. And some of those are to be expected, for sure. Rugged country and dodgy weather will always increase the average. But the fact is, if you sit down and do the research, there are more unexplained disappearances here than anywhere else in the country. He talked about his work cataloguing Tasmanian folklore and other strange stories and encounters from the University of Tasmania, and he went into some detail about the statistics of some of these encounters before coming to my story. Now, this brings us to your case. I doubt you remember being so young, but it caused quite a stir at the time, and it's never really gone away. And there are still people with loads of different theories. I probably see a reference to it on a forum somewhere, at least once a month. I had really picked up some of the missing 411 stuff out in the US, if you saw any of that. Anyway, that particular string of disappearances always intrigued me, and I could never work it out. But you've rattled a few things loose in this old brain of mine. Why don't we start with your story, the one your grandfather told you? Sure. Have you heard it before? Not exactly, no. But there are familiar elements to it. For example, I have heard mentions of old things several times before. The one that stands out is in a story that I believe originally came from the early settlers in the Savage River area. The two brothers who lived out of a cabin met a luckless trapper who invited him to stay with them for a few days in exchange for a few of his furs. Now back then, there was a loose community of widespread people trying to make a go of it out of the frontier. And so, a couple of days later, a neighbor from a couple of miles away rode over to ask for help moving some fallen trees. Instead, he found both brothers dead. I won't go into detail that the person I heard it from did, but suffice to say that they were killed with an axe and apparently a lot of rage. Even stranger, the few animals they had brought with them were all killed too, gutted and spread out over the ground in a rough circle. The man returned with a search party and it didn't take him long to find the trapper. He was sitting in a small clearing on a flat stone, totally naked and covered in dried blood. It seemed like he had been there for a while. They arrested him and he didn't resist. He also refused to speak, simply responding to any questions with a strange, absent grin. The men thought he must have lost his mind. They sent him to a town several days' ride away for a constable, but he couldn't get any more out of the man. With no real option and a very clear law, they decided that, insane or not, he clearly murdered the brothers, and therefore he would hang. Oh my God. As he went to the gallows, the trapper kept that same absent smile. The only time he struggled was when they tried to put a blindfold on. In the end, they decided not to bother, and they slipped a noose over his neck. Finally, the trapper reacted. He laughed. The few people who had come to the execution didn't know what to do, and the trapper kept laughing. And eventually, he spoke. He told them that he had done what the old things required him to do. that they would all meet the same fate no matter what they did to him. He told them that the old things were waking up, and that he was glad to die before they did. In the middle of the rant, one of the men kicked his feet out from under him, and they say the smile never left his face. Jesus. I was enough to drive settlers away eventually. The events with the trapper and the murder started it, but they said that the bush out there was darker than anywhere else, and stranger. Of course, you have to remember that this is anecdotal evidence. Records from that time were poor anyway, and not much survived from places like that, especially. But hearing your story mention the old things in a completely different cultural context is very interesting. Okay, said Nate. But what do you know about the eclipses? Or Maram? Or some kind of door? I'm getting there, Mark responded with a chuckle. This stuff is complex. There's a lot going on here. Ah, my bad. There are a couple of things you'll need to leave with me for a bit. Lunar eclipses are all well and good, but whether they relate to a pattern or not, I can't say without researching it. The old things ring more than one bell, but I'll need to remember where it's from. The name Maram is not familiar to me immediately, but I feel like I've heard it before. I've heard thousands of stories over the years, although admittedly not as many indigenous legends. So many of those have been lost. He shook his head sadly. Now, the door. Well, that's interesting. Although it's vague and it's the first time I've heard anything like that referenced in Tasmania. I have heard stories about something like that when I was trying to establish a link between some of the indigenous folklore here and on the mainland. Except they called it a gateway. I remember that it felt incongruous. Not to put too fine a point on it, but these people didn't even have a word for the gate in their native language, or door for that matter. I thought they must have just been using an English word to loosely describe something, but they told me that the gate had been there long before white settlement. They said the word they used was Ubura Ka, borrowed from a language that preceded theirs. It means the path of misery, or the path of the wicked, depending on who you ask. Nate looked put off, but he tended to want to believe in some of the strangeness of the world. I didn't necessarily see any of this as definitive, even if I felt like something within me agreed. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything, does it? There are a lot of myths and legends out there. Surely some are going to overlap? Sure they will. They do. Hundreds of Aboriginal myths line up. But in 40 years I have only ever heard this mentioned once. Maybe twice if we accept that your story is related. Which, even though it is anecdotal, seems likely. Think about it. What would you say the odds are of two tribes on either side of the Bass Strait, both having a myth that references the same basic thing? And when that thing does not have a word in their languages. This is history, not so much science. Anecdotes are often all we have, especially doing something this obscure. So, while I can't say they're definitely related, I can say that it seems likely. Like what? What is the door, or the Uberaka, or whatever you call it? I couldn't tell you. This myth is ancient, way older than anything else they remember. They know that the gate is no longer there. They don't know when, but it moved. That seems to fit with your story, too. The creature tells Maram that he will be bound to the door wherever it goes. This tribe also believed that the gate was the source of many evil spirits. Old things, maybe. It bears some more research, I think. With that, he told us he would be in contact as soon as he had anything, waving an arm vaguely at the massive pile of papers and books on the table and the shelves that lined the walls. I didn't feel like he ushered us out, but he made it clear that if we wanted answers, we were going to have to let him work on it, which I didn't mind. I had my own things to do, too. I felt it was time for me to go back to the place it all began, even if I found nothing. Nate and I said our goodbyes and headed off, eventually moving northwest. I didn't know what I expected to find, if I just wanted to break through a barrier for my own reasons, but as the dark forest closed back around us, I must admit I felt more than a little nervous. And for the first time in over 20 years, I settled in for the trip to the Tarkin wilderness. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The 4 horns of Janala. Let's get straight into that. The Tarkin isn't as large as the other wilderness areas in Tasmania, although it's right up there. It's also not as remote overall. Bordering the coast along its northern edge means that it can be easily accessed by many of the residents and tourists who enjoy the north coast. It makes up for that with a wide range of terrain. Swamps and grasslands share the same national park as small, rugged mountain valleys and thick, dense, ancient rainforest that wouldn't be out of place in a fantasy novel. The southern edge of the wilderness is far more remote than the north, and with very few visitors outside of serious hikers and the parks and wildlife rangers. This southern edge is closer to where I eventually ended up in 1997, but we were in the north when I disappeared, and so that's where we started. We entered the wilderness as near as I could to where my parents had gone on that trip. The actual entrance to the tracks had changed over the years, moving east, but the tracks are still very much the same, and we quickly found the right path. Anywhere in Tasmania, the weather can change in a split second, and we were reminded of that early on in the first day of our hike. Nate and I set out under the clear skies and warm sunlight, winding our way along the path that took us through clumps of forests and open meadows of green and red grasses. Within an hour, the sun had retreated behind a grim black clouds. The temperature had dropped into single digits, and we were being drenched by freezing rain. And the rainforest provided some shelter, the thick canopy of leaves and intertwining branches blocking out a bit of the rain. But the path had become treacherous. Every step brought the risk of slipping on the slick rocks or the ever-present moss, and as we trekked deeper, the terrain became more rugged. We were descending into a small valley, and the rain had created a heavy mist that seeped into every nook and cranny of the forest. Eventually, late in the day, tired and cold and soggy, we came to an overhang and decided we should settle in for the afternoon and try to wait out the rain. It didn't keep us totally dry, but a hastily erected tent fixed that, and a gas camping heater and stove slowly started to thaw us out and dry our sodden socks. And over a cup of tea, Nate grilled me about how the whole trip made me feel. I'm okay, really. I was pretty anxious about the whole trip, but apart from being a little jumpy, I'm fine. I'm glad I'm not out here alone, though. And have you had any, I don't know, epiphanies or flashbacks or whatever? Nothing. None of this looks familiar, which I guess isn't really unexpected. I'm not sure I thought I'd really recognize anything from when I was 8. Honestly, I'm not really sure what I expected at all. I don't think we should be expecting anything. Just enjoy the trip. If that's the only thing that comes out of this, then at least you've beaten a demon or two of your own and taken another step towards putting all of this behind you, right? I guess. Anyway, we've only gone a little way. I think we were further in when it happened. I'm not going to get too disheartened. I didn't mention it at the time, but based on my dreams and the stories, I had started to believe more than I would have liked. I wouldn't have been at all disheartened if nothing happened. We bounced what we had learned from Mark back and forth as the dull grey skies started turning dark. The rain slowly eased off, leaving a glistening forest wreathed in fog. It was beautiful, and I found myself feeling glad that I had come. A sense of peace settled over me as we talked and laughed in the darkness of the forest. And for the first time in months, I slept easily. We entered a clearing the afternoon of the next day, and I froze. My gaze had settled on a very unique tree, one that seemed to split at right angles midway up the trunk as though it had once been cleaved down the middle and continued growing. I suddenly felt like all the air had been expelled from my lungs, and I swayed as a wave of nausea swept over me, and I knew that tree. Nate quickly turned back and put an arm around me. "Whoa, are you okay? What is it?" And he followed my eyes to the tree. I wanted to climb it, but Mum and Dad said no. I love climbing trees. It made me feel like a superhero, and this one looks so cool. But they thought the moss on the branches might make me fall. I felt really hard done by it, and I sulked around while they started to set up camp. The tent, it would have been over that side of the clearing, near the big rocks. I sat there and I watched them. And I pointed to the rock pile that kept the forest at bay on the right-hand side of the small clearing. Well, for some reason, that pile of rocks made me shudder unconsciously, discomfort crawling up my spine. Nate hugged me, concerned. I feel like there's more, but I just can't remember. It's so frustrating. I know it's there, but it's like it's behind a door or something. Something I haven't got the key to. An appropriate choice of words, I suppose. Maybe we should set up here for the night. Yeah, maybe. I couldn't help but being drawn to that pile of rocks. I noticed, as I looked closer, a small trail leading into the forest behind it. A game trail, maybe? Or an old, overgrown track. Hey, Nate? Let's walk down that little track for a bit, see if anything else sticks out. He peered into the secluded brush. Sure, if we can get anywhere along it. Why don't we head down there and see what we can see and then come back and camp here tonight? I agreed and headed towards the tiny game trail with purpose. My stomach twisted in knots and I wanted to try and work myself into ignoring it. Before I realized it, I ducked under the foliage and into the forest. A few meters in, the path opened up enough that we could at least stand. Further down, a flash of brown fur put me on edge for a moment before I realized that we'd startled a small group of panda melons and set them bounding off into the brush. Clearly, the trail was still well used by the local wildlife. And beyond that, though, it looked like a bit of a waste of time. We walked for about an hour and a half, but the forest all looked the same off the main trail. Very few things stood out the way the split tree and the rocks had in the clearing, and my memory stayed fuzzy and frustrated. I almost decided to give up and head back when I saw something just off of the path. And to my right, I spotted a small clearing through the trees, strangely bare of vegetation. I felt somehow drawn to it. As I stepped through the forest and into the open space, the sounds of the bush seemed to fade away. The reason for the lack of vegetation became clear immediately. Underfoot, the ground was actually an immense slab of stone, maybe the top of a flat rock, mostly buried in the earth. Apart from a covering of seemingly ambiguous lichen, some moss and scattered leaves, it prevented anything from growing. More than that, though, it gave the whole space an eerie feeling, somehow detached and removed from the rest of the forest. I felt different, and I remembered that feeling, thinking I'd entered a magical place. And then a word popped into my head. Yanala. Behind me, Nate reacted to my whisper. What was that? I'm not sure. It just came to me. Okay. When you walked into here, you mean? I nodded. And do you think it's important? Yes, but I can't tell you why. I mean, I feel like it's important, but I can't remember anything about why it would be. It's just a word that my brain shouted out when I came into this spot. I tried to cross the clearing and see if I could get anywhere on the other side, but the forest kept me firmly within the stone area as well as any wall. Nate, on the other hand, looked down, and while I tried to breach the thick old-growth forest, he knelt down and brushed away the leaves from something in the middle of the stone slab. "Caitlin, look at this." He crouched over something in the centre of the clearing, a pattern or a carving in the stone. I could see it even from a few metres away and partly obscured by the moss that Nate had started to pull out of the lines. As he did, the pattern became clearer. I had no doubt that it had been carved by human hands at some point in history. The lines weren't natural, and the way it was weathered spoke to the age of it. Tasmanian Aborigines were known to carve more often than most of the mainland compatriots, although this shape looked different to any of the carvings my grandfather had ever shown me. Nate finished scraping away the moss from half of the carving and stood back, trying to get a sense of what we were looking at. The carving spanned out about 3 meters. I couldn't be sure which way it had originally been oriented, but it was simple enough. A large circle with a pair of eyes and then what looked like 4 legs. I guessed it must have been some sort of simple animal representation. I couldn't put my finger on why, but that carving made me deeply anxious and uneasy. Nate wanted to stay and check out the rest of the stone for more carvings, but I convinced him to head back to the main track. As we left the stone clearing with its strange carving, I realised that the place felt colder than the rest of the forest. A shiver ran down my spine as we stepped out and onto the game trail, and, for the barest moment, I could have sworn I heard a whisper on the wind. And then we were out of view, and the forest returned to normal again. Later that evening, Nate and I were sitting around the stove cooking. The sun had come out again, and being summer so far south, it still had a way to go before setting. The golden light warmed the still damp forest and filled the air with a thin mist as all that moisture started to evaporate. Glancing around the clearing, I noticed that the sun had cast the rocks by the game trail in the shadow. As those shadows shifted on the breeze, I froze. That rock pile. "Caitlin, you've been staring over there for like 2 minutes. Is everything all right?" "No, Nate," and turned back to him, aware of the tears that had started forming in my eyes. He seemed taken aback and scooted closer. "What's wrong?" "Yanala. I remember. Yanala." He sat close, not pushing me to speak about it, but another set of memories bloomed in my mind. "It was by the rocks. Mum and Dad were setting up the tent and they wouldn't let me climb the tree, and so I climbed up the rocks instead and sat there. Around the other side, I couldn't see them, not really. I was soaking about the tree and didn't even want to see them, and so I sat there for a while. And then I saw something down in the shadows. I couldn't really make out what it was, but I thought it must have been an animal or something. It was black and furry, maybe like a devil, but it seemed pretty big. I was curious, and so I said hello. You know how kids are." "Okay, then what?" It said hello back. Well, that seemed completely normal to me as a kid. It asked me what I was doing, and I said we were camping. I asked it why it was hiding, and it told me that it wasn't hiding. I just couldn't see it properly. I don't think it knew what that meant, and so I asked if it was magic. It said that it supposed it was. I took a deep breath, my throat tightening with a combination of tears and terror, and Nate squeezed my shoulder. I asked it what its name was, and it told me that it didn't have one. I said something about everything having a name, and it said that really only new things had names, which I didn't really understand. It said that it had been called many things, and it told me that people like me used to call it Yanala, and that I could too. I said that was a funny name. It said it was a name for a messenger, and then it told me that I should be careful, and I thought I had offended it. But then it said that things were waking up. Bad things. Yanala told me that I wasn't one of the ones they were looking for, and that I should go back to my parents. And then I don't know, it stood up, and I saw it. I looked over at my parents and I fucking followed it into the forest, Nate. I started crying then. The emotion of the memory and the feeling like I was living it for the first time again overwhelmed me. Nate did all he could. He hugged me and just let me cry it out. The memories only really seemed to go a little bit further, but I guess knowing now that something completely outside of the world of normal things had happened to me sent me over the edge a little bit. I settled down after a while and felt like I needed to finish. I followed the Yanala into the bush, down the game trail, but it was a slightly different trail then. It ran straight into the clearing, the one with the stone carving. And by the time we got there, it had gotten dark somehow. It should have only been about 5:30, but the sun had completely gone. I was cold and the forest started to whisper. I'd been sneaking around, but I started to cry, and Yanala heard me. It turned around and I heard it speak again. It sounded sad. It told me that I should not have followed it, and that it could not protect me. And then it vanished into the stone, and I was totally alone. Jesus, Caitlin. That's not the worst of it. I mean, that's pretty much all I could remember for now, but in the clearing, I finally saw Yanala properly. Nate, I was huge and covered in black fur. I couldn't tell exactly what it looked like through all the fur, but it had 4 horns on its head. I drew the symbol from the clearing in the dirt by the stove, upside down, and Nate's eyes widened. A circle, 2 eyes and 4 horns, not legs. The carving is a representation of Yanala, or whatever it really is, and Yanala is the thing from my grandpa's story. I think. Fuck, this is all so crazy, but I think that clearing is where the elder spoke to Yanala in the story. That's what the carving means. He sat back in shock, silent for a moment. Does that mean the stone clearing is the door? I thought about it for a moment, but I didn't think so. I doubt it. The stories say the door or the gate moves. Maybe it was a door at some point, but I don't think so. I think the door itself is something different, and the clearing is something else. But I've got no fucking idea, honestly. I'm not sure I want to keep doing this. Nate, I don't know if we can keep dragging all this stuff up. It's too much. He took my hand but said nothing else. There wasn't really anything else he could say. But I had one more memory I agonized over telling him for a few quiet moments. There's one other thing. When the Yanala disappeared and I thought that I was alone, I wasn't. I remember noticing that the ground was suddenly covered with crawling things, but there was something else. A horrible thing, like a shadow. It rose from the other side of the clearing, and it had these smoking purple eyes. It looked at me and laughed. I just ran. I think that thing was Marum, Nate. What makes you think that? Because of what it said as I ran away. I had tears in my eyes again, the fear fresh in my chest as though everything had just happened that day. It said I could run as fast and as far as I liked, but it wouldn't matter. It said the door was opening and the old things were coming. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. Uncle Crazy and the things that return. Let's get straight into that. I was back in the forest, the one with the bloody moss. I looked down at my hands, my arms, and I realised that I was covered in blood or whatever soaked into the moss too. And closer to the trees I could see that a red substance came from them. It oozed out of the bark like sap, but when I reached out to touch it, I found it was warm. The trees here were massive. The roots were like those ones you see in a rainforest, buttressed, I think. The tops of the roots were taller than me. I looked up and I saw this creature sitting on the root. It looked like a furry black bird, or kind of, but it had these skeletal wings and more of a mouth than a beak. It opened its mouth wide, far wider than it should have, and I could see bits of meat caught in between the teeth that looked so jagged, like they'd all been smashed. Suddenly, something dragged me to one side as the thing lunged at me. The woman from before, I think. I could see her better here. She was Aboriginal, and she looked different somehow. I think she had something wrong with her facial bones. I don't know. She also had filed her teeth to points, but I didn't think she wanted to hurt me. She'd already kept me safe from the shadow thing, and now that bird. The woman dragged me off through the forest. My arm hurt, but I was too scared to say anything, and she seemed to be in a real hurry. And suddenly, we came out into a more open space, free of huge roots, and I could see why. Walking through the trees were 3 or 4 huge creatures, or at least their legs. Only one of them was small enough for me to see their whole bodies, before they vanished into the leaves of the trees. It's hard to describe what they looked like. I think they looked kind of wooden, like their skin was more like bark, or maybe stone. All over their bodies they had protrusions, spikes and bumps. I only got a quick glimpse of them before the shadows moved, and they pulled and slithered out from under the trees like oil before heading straight for us. I saw their almost featureless faces, mouths and eyes weeping red fluid before I woke up. Is this real? How could any of this be real? That sleep diary came from 5 days after Nate and I left Tarkine. Although I'd turned them into more of nightmare diaries, well, when I remembered to anyway. I don't know why I kept doing them. We were staying in a wilderness lodge near Cradle Mountain, just trying to process how I felt after the revelations and returning memories of the forest trip. Nate had wanted 2 separate cabins, but I convinced him that I absolutely didn't want to be alone, given everything that was going on. And since the clearing, I'd found myself occasionally feeling a presence behind me on the trail, or the back seat of the car, or the corner of the room. But when I looked, there was never anything there. I felt watched, but I could never work out by who or what. We checked in the day and we walked out to the forest, Nate driving us to Cradle Mountain while I stared off into nothing. I'm not sure if I spoke a single word that day. I basically spent the first few days it took to hike out and then the first day or so at Cradle Mountain in a complete daze. So, if anything had happened, I'm not sure I would have remembered it. Most of all, I think I was trying to work out if I wanted to go any further with this. Everything had been so insane that I didn't know if I wanted to remember any more. On the 3rd morning, though, I decided I did. Nate and I were sitting in front of a small fire, eating breakfast, and talking generically about a stuff that I remembered when his phone rang. "It's Mark," he said, looking at the screen with a frown. He picked up the call, greeted Mark, and asked if he could put him on speaker so I could hear what he had to say. "Listen, you two. You need to stop looking for this, now." And Nate and I must have both had the same, what the hell, moment when Mark's voice came out of the phone, urgent and frightened. "What? Mark, what's up?" "I need to see you face to face, Nathaniel. You need to stop. Where are you?" Nathaniel told him, and he said he'd be there in about an hour, and then he hung up. "What the hell? What was that all about, Nate?" He looked concerned. "I have no idea, but I never know Mark to act like that. Whatever he found, I don't think it's good." Mark knocked on the door to our cabin just over an hour later, hard enough that I thought it might come off its hinges. Nate answered, and spent a couple of minutes calming the man down before bringing him in through to the lounge area. I think he thought that a worked-up Mark might affect me in the wrong way, because when they did come in, Mark made me a sheepish apology as he sat down. "Do you guys have a kettle in here? I could really use a cup of tea." And then he settled in and waited for Nate to join us. "Look, I'm sorry if I was a bit over the top earlier, but I was a little bit shocked. I found a lot, actually." And he sighed and removed his glasses. "I meant what I said. You guys need to drop this. It's so much more dangerous than I could have ever thought it might be." I frowned. "What does that mean, though? Isn't this all just stories and dreams?" I believed what I'd experienced, but I'd been pretty sure Mark had a more scientific approach. He shook his head. "Yeah, realistically, some of what I do is just recording myths and legends. Most of it. But some of it is way more than that. I do this because I know that sometimes myths and legends are a lot more." "What do you mean?" "Not important. What is important is that I spoke to the elders of the community that originally told me the story about the gate, and they were reluctant to talk much as they were before, until I mentioned what you had gone through and the story you told me. Within half an hour, I was talking to a guy who is basically the premier historian for their community. He told me a lot, and it's all kind of rambling because I get the feeling the bloke is about 90 years old. But I'm going to start with the story he told me." He produced a little recorder of some kind, set it on the table, and pressed play. "The gate moved sometime before I was born, we think. But before then, brother, it had been on the headland for years. I mean, we call it a headland, but it's about 10 clicks end to end. You've got to understand what the gate is, I suppose. But the problem is, I don't reckon anyone really does. I know I don't. You see, brother, our ancestors left this place because of it, and they mixed with another mob, so our stories and our history gets mixed up too. When our ancestors came out here, out from Africa, I suppose, before the dreaming, they were the first, but they were also the last. They were the last people to find their place. Before that is, this land had no people. It was the oldest place left, and it was very different to the rest of the world. In this land stood a gate, or a door, or a path that had stood for millions of years. Where it went, we don't know. Why it was created or by who, we don't know. We don't even know if it always moved or if we somehow made it move. But that gate was powerful, brother. Powerful and evil. The gate is the only way the elder things, the things that existed before, can get back to our world. The only place they can still survive. But they can still spread their influence, and when they all wake up, they can still come through. That's why the gate is so dangerous. Now, When the gate was here, it attracted people, you know? I guess like when you have a town with a haunted house or something else bad. People go for a thrill. They go to prove how brave they are. They go to see if it's real. But, you see, this ain't no haunted house. This thing is real. I've seen what it does. When I was a little boy, the gate was already gone. But the people who went there before it did, some of them were still around. And brother, they came back changed. And there was one old man we called Uncle Crazy. He lived out in a bush, but we were told if we ever saw him, we had to run straight back to town and not look back. And the story goes, Uncle Crazy was one of those young fellas who wanted more from his life. Back then, the white fellas wouldn't let us do a lot. You understand. And we didn't have any warriors left or any reason for them really. Things were modern enough that people thought the gate was just a story. I don't know why, but for some reason, only some fellas ever seemed to find the thing. Anyway, Uncle Crazy wanted to go to the gate. He wanted to prove he was tough, I suppose. And probably Uncle Crazy was already a bit crazy. Anyway, he went off out to the headland with a couple of other fellas. It had been years since anyone had gone out there, and that's how it goes, ain't it? Something happens, people stop going someplace, and people eventually forget, and so other people go back. No one knew they were going until after they went. When the elders found out, they were angry. But more than that, they were terrified. You see, the last fellas who had gone out there not only came back different, but they brought something back with them. A sickness, they said. Folks started losing their minds, dancing out in the moon covered in animal blood. Or worse, when one of them cut off a neighbor's face and stitched it onto their own. The elders had to do something about it. They rounded the crazies up, which they said took every man in the village because these fellas were too strong, and they banished them to the headland. None of them ever came back. Anyway, Uncle Crazy had gone, and so all any fella could do was wait. But days ticked on and no sign of him and his boys. Eventually, they just figured the gate or something from the gate had got them fellas. A few weeks after that, Uncle Crazy sort of wandered into the village, but no sign of the others. Well, one sign. You see, Uncle Crazy was wearing something when they found him. Something made of skin. Human skin. He had skinned his mates and made a cloak, even stitched bits together. Grim stuff. Of course, they couldn't call the authorities. Even if they did believe them, black fellas weren't worth much in the eyes of the coppers back then. And so, they chased old Crazy off with spears and arrows. Every time he came back, they chased him off. Eventually, even his cooked brain got the message. Used to see him around a bit, but he never came into the village. I only ever saw him once, and let me tell you, brother, that was more than enough. This mad fellow wore animal skins, and he painted himself totally red. And when I ran into him, he was squatted down in a clearing. I was behind him when I came up on him, and so I couldn't see what he was doing. I tried to back up out of there, but he had heard me. And when he whipped around, brother, have you seen a predator get startled? Like a big cat or something. He moved like that. Took that one movement to show me Uncle Crazy wasn't no man. Not anymore. He stared at me, and his eyes, and they were pure white. And then he snarled like a dog, and his teeth were all sharp. But they were long, too, like they had grown. I just ran, brother. The point is, Uncle Crazy might have been the last of our mob to go out to the gate, but wherever it is now, no fella's safe. That thing, whatever it is, ain't a thing to stuff about with. You hear? The things that return from there, well, that's pure perversion. Mark clicked off the recorder, and Nate and I shared a horrific glance. The stories, while told in a hard-to-follow manner, were dark, and I think being told stories about the door affecting people recently had a more profound impact than hearing something supposedly from thousands of years ago. And still, stories were just that, right? Okay, I said. Well, that was fucking creepy. But I don't get why that would get you so worked up. And surely you've heard much worse. Mark stared out the window, into the forest, but not at anything in particular. His mind was clearly elsewhere. I've heard much worse, sure, but I've seen much worse with my own eyes. He let his words sit for a moment, heavy between the three of us, while he stared at something millions of miles away, and then he changed direction. Anyway, these guys are the best source of information I can find on the door, but things they said resonated with me. Without wasting too much time on it, they say that the door influences the world around it, and that it attracts, or maybe generates, evil. And they say that those who get close enough to be influenced by the door change, like Uncle Crazy, but those who actually go through the door find something much worse. The other thing that really interests me is that they say the door isn't part of their mythology, because it's not part of their world. It's older, and it was here before the dream time. He took a gulp of his now cold tea, seemingly not fussed by the temperature, lost deep in thought. I took some of those things and I cross-referenced a few other stories I found along the way. Way more than I thought possible. Elements of their stories about the door pop up in about 5% of everything I've catalogued. That doesn't mean that 5% have anything to do with the door, but it means that some will absolutely. Even if it's half of those, that's a massive number. Do you know how many stories you hear when you seek them out actively for 40 years? I started to fidget, uncomfortable. You're talking as though all of this is real? Don't you think it is, Caitlin? I mean, I'm not sure. I think I experienced something, but how much of it is just nightmares and how much of it is real? Oh, I'm so confused at the moment. I'm not sure we're real. Mark looked at me sternly, but with an obvious sympathy. Look, I've catalogued a lot of stories and a lot of folklore in my life, and some of it obviously not real, and some very real. Not all of the unreal stuff has been supernatural, and not all of the obviously real has been properly explainable. When you first came to me last week, I'd have said this one fell into the middle, a story perhaps based on years of legend and a touch of truth. But speaking to those people and doing the research, I've realized something that changed my mind. You mean something that makes you think that it's all real? Mark nodded, his face now slightly ashen. Yes. The thing about the new information is that sometimes it can make things that happened in the past make a whole lot more sense. This door, or gate, or evil energy vortex, or whatever it really is, I'm nearly certain I've encountered it myself. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The Wild Rivers Massacre. Let's get straight into that. Have you ever heard of the Wild Rivers Massacre? No? I'm not surprised, really. Tasmania was small back then. News didn't travel the way it does now, and this wasn't something many people wanted to spread. It was also well before you were born. And massacre is a bit of a sensationalist, but nevertheless 6 people died brutally. I was quite young at the time, and new to all of this. I had only been collecting my stories for perhaps 2 years when the massacre happened in the winter of 1979. And I had been living in Strahan for about a year at the time, recording the stories of one or more unusual and overlooked historical towns in Australia. And they called me in because they needed an input into some of the details, some of the stranger aspects of the killings, and they thought that maybe someone with my background would be able to help them catch the killers. There were similarly important, possibly ritualistic symbols found around the site, as well as some of the things done to the victims that had confused and, I suppose, frightened the investigators. The killings took place in a remote part of the forest, with Wild Rivers National Park, so remote that we had to get in or out via the Gordon River. This is old logging country, the kind of place loggers used to spend months at a time painstakingly sawing down trees and dragging them to the river to float out the mills in Strahan. And plenty of men had died out there over the years, but not many died like those 6 poor souls in '79. We had to go hours upriver to even get to the right area, and then camp overnight before making a 4-hour hike into the forest to find the site. Out there, if they had not been working for forestry and in constant contact with their employers via radio, I'm not sure they would have ever been found. Certainly not as soon as they were. As it was, it took 5 days for anyone to be sent, another 2 for the site to be reached, and another 2 more for any police or anything to make it out there. 2 weeks had almost passed by the time I set foot into their camp, and the bodies were long since moved. The site they had called home for the duration wasn't so much of a clearing, but a large flat area near a small stream with sparse tree coverage. On my hike in, my guides told me the details. They were not pretty. 6 bodies were found, although not at first. At first, they had no real idea of how many bodies there were. The initial party walked into a campsite that looked more like a butchery. Those poor bastards had been totally dismembered. Pieces of people strewn all over the camp. I had to look at the photos of the scene later. It was horrifying. I still have the odd nightmare about it. I'll spare the more horrific and irrelevant details, but some of it is certainly relevant. The long pieces, arms and legs, had been arranged in a pattern, a sort of concentric spiral in the middle of the camp. The intestines were laid around the spiral in 6 wavy lines, as though they were radiating out from below the spiral shape. Around the top of the spiral, 4 heads were arranged to follow the curve. It almost looked like some kind of jellyfish representation. Certainly nothing I knew of, or know of to this day, in terms of indigenous, occult or arcane symbols. The rest of the remnants of the bodies were dumped in piles. On the tents and some of the trees and rocks around the place, the killers had drawn symbols in blood. More symbols I didn't recognize. My guide took me through those symbols, now brown stains in the fabric, as well as the location of the body parts and a few other points of interest. I was in well over my head, and I knew it. The problem I had was that no one else had ever seen any of those symbols before either, and so I had no way to determine what they meant or why they might be relevant to the killings. Originally, there had been 8 researchers out in the field. Given that only 6 bodies were found, the police believed that one or both of the missing people must have been the killer. And before losing all contact, the group had been acting strangely in their reports back. I heard some of the transmissions myself. About a week before they had lost contact, one of the researchers reported seeing a man in the forest. Well, that was unusual, but not unheard of. The forests out here are home to a surprising number of hermits and social outcasts. I've heard enough stories of people who just never came back to society once trapping and logging were banned, that I believe there are probably even a very small communities way out there in some places. The next transmission I heard was from that same researcher. He said he'd been followed by a man this time, a man who crept along on all 4s like an ape. The man looked feral, and he had milky white eyes that led the researcher to wonder if he was blind. I didn't know it at the time, obviously, but that feral man bears a striking resemblance to Uncle Crazy, who allegedly came into contact with the gate. Of course, at first the police didn't put much credence into the sighting because the man who reported it was one of the 2 missing conservationists. They believed he had suffered a psychotic break, especially based on the other transmissions he'd sent, He spoke about living shadows and missing time. He spoke about hearing voices. My problem with that idea was that others mentioned missing time and hearing things in their reports too. The last contact with the group, their final transmission late in the evening, was bizarre. The unidentified man who sent it spoke in a monotone, reciting sort of nonsense poem or chant. The things that come, the things that feed, the things that rip and tear, the things that wait, the things that bleed, the things that gather there. The police believed that was the man they posited as the murderer, but I disagreed. The other thing I noticed on that tape were the sounds in the background. It could have just been an artifact or poor quality, but I found if I turned it right up, I could make out something behind the man's voice, like other voices in the distance or maybe whispering. It could easily have been others in the group, but I couldn't make out any words that were in English. Searchers went out into the bush for weeks, combing the forest for any sign of them. One group reported that they had found some kind of dwellings in a series of small caves in the mountains further to the north. Before they could come back to take anyone else out there, though, that group disappeared without a trace. And despite an extra week of searching the area they had been in at the time, the search was called off. And then all the resources pulled back to civilization. Winter had well and truly set in, and it was dangerous to be out in the forest. The missing two, along with the 4 missing searchers, were never found. My association with the investigation ended there too, but I believe the police did send a small team into the forest over the summer. I'm not sure if they ever found any more evidence or the supposed dwellings. I kept an eye out for any symbols like those I'd seen in that horrible place, but I never did find anything like them. As far as I know, it's still an open case. Mark told his story, almost like a university professor, slipping into an academic mould that I hadn't seen from him before. When he finished, he shook his head as if it would help him clear the memories from his mind, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that it didn't. So, when you ask me if I think the door is real, I don't know. I don't know if I believe there is some gateway, physical or metaphysical, into some other world or place, but I do know that something happened in the wild rivers that I have never been able to explain. And even if you could accept that it was the work of people with some kind of religious or cult connection to a myth about that door, they are very real and very violent. People still disappear in that area, even though it's very rarely visited. That's why I believe you should drop this. Either there is a group of very dangerous people associated with the myth in some way, or this thing is based on something real that has to lead to more than 29 deaths and disappearances around the area where the massacre happened. Nate had turned a little pale. I wondered if I looked the same. Clearly something terrible happened out there in the national park, something that had affected Mark deeply. For me, though, the story had the opposite effect to what he had intended. I had to go to the Wild Rivers National Park. I asked Mark about the symbols on the tents, and he happily drew them onto the hotel stationery. Most of them were absolutely meaningless to me, but the third symbol he drew quickened my heart. A circle with 2 dots inside and 4 lines on top. A head and 4 horns. The symbol of the emissary to the old things. The symbol of the many-horned messenger, Yenala. As soon as Mark left, with the assurances that we were going to seriously consider what he had said, I started packing my stuff. My actions were apparently astonishing to Nate, who put himself in the doorway to block a return trip to my room to get more of my things. "Whoa, Caitlin, what's the plan here?" "I'm going to Strahan. I need to see this through. Not just for me. I think this is dangerous, Nate. I think something's happening and it's not good." "What does that mean?" I sat back down onto one of the armchairs and gathered my thoughts. I've been dreaming and remembering things about places and things that can't exist, but I believe they do. The things I remember, like Yanala and Maram, and what they told me. The eclipses and everything associated with them. My disappearance, my dreams, the fact that the same number of people vanished in wild rivers and when I went missing, as were supposed to be sent out for the hunt in the original story. I mean, I just can't not think that something's happening. It's not just about me anymore. I just feel it in a way I can't describe. Something is coming, and I feel like I'm linked to it. Suddenly, I was crying without really knowing why, a deep sense of powerless sorrow settling over me. It didn't feel like it came from within me, and somehow, more like it was an external force I couldn't resist. Nate moved to comfort me, wrapping me in a hug that we held until the feeling passed. Except, it never really passed. Not completely. I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. I must just be exhausted by all of this. I didn't believe that myself, but I didn't know what else it could be. Maybe some kind of subconscious response to the likelihood of encountering something, like in my dreams, all over again. You don't have to come, Nate. I can do this myself. I think Mark is right, and whatever this is, it's bloody dangerous. Nate kissed me on the forehead gently. Not necessarily a romantic gesture, just an affirming, calming one. Of course I'll come. I'm not going to let you go wandering in some crazy ancient hellhole alone. I wanted to help you work this out ever since we were kids, and I'd be a pretty shitty bloke if I pulled the plug now, wouldn't I? Thanks. That means a lot, Nate. But we should get going before I lose my nerve and I change my mind. Strahan is a pretty little town on the west coast of Tasmania, on the shores of Macquarie Harbour. It used to be a major logging port, utilising the Gordon River to access deep old-growth forest, and these days it's mostly an ecotourism town. You can do a famous cruise around the harbour and up the Gordon River. My parents took me on it once as a kid, and it was cool. I saw a bunch of seals. With dawn breaking, I saw the boats down at the docks and wished we were here for something like that instead. There are no real roads to Strahan into the Franklin Gordon Wild Rivers National Park. It's possible to hike in, but the distance we would be travelling made it an unpleasant option. Ditto for the access points along the Lyle Highway, which meant our only real option would be the Gordon River. It also made sense because that's the way Mark had gone in 1979. A couple of days of research in Strahan had given us a likely location for the massacre, somewhere to the north of Gordon, along an old logging track near an unnamed creek. Nate had managed to get us a drop-off further up the river by boat, but we would have to make the last few kilometres of the river journey by kayak. Macquarie Harbour and Gordon River are stunningly beautiful. The water is deeply tannin-stained, and once you move into the river, the forest is thick and impassable right down to the edge of the water. Like so many places in Tasmania, there is an undeniable magic to it, and I tried my best to focus on that instead of the growing knot of fear in my gut. All too soon, though, I had to face that fear in a more real way. We were in the kayaks and off up the wilder section of the river. As the sound of the boat motor faded away, replaced by the gentle sound of paddles dipping into the dark water and the birds that filled the trees, hours passed in relative silence, and both of us lost in our own thoughts, muscles burning as we propelled ourselves up the river. By mid-afternoon, we took the sweeping turn east with the river, and shortly after, the cleared land that marked the entrance to the long-abandoned logging track opened up on the north bank. We pulled the kayaks out and dragged them up under the canopy and set off into the forest. The sun had almost gone by the time we found the clearing, although Mark's description had been closer. Long grass had overtaken the once empty space between several unusually wide-spaced trees, but I knew we had found the massacre site. I could feel it, and I could feel more than that too. Something tugged at me, something that I couldn't really explain. As I looked around the grassy meadow, I felt a sudden, crushing dizziness, and I heard whispers rushing, roaring through my head, and before I could even reach out to Nate to steady myself, I heard that sick laughter, the twisted cackling of the ancient creature that accompanies the door, and then the ground raced up to meet me. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The fate of the hunt. Let's get straight into that. I woke up in a tent, the light of a small fire flickering against the canvas. Nate must have set up camp while I was unconscious. Wait, how long have I been unconscious? Nate must have heard me roll around in the tent because he stuck in his head, face tight with concern. Oh, thank fuck. You scared the shit out of me, Caitlin. I was about 10 minutes away from using the PLB. I just fainted. Yeah, and then smacked your head into the ground. You just dropped. I couldn't get there in time. Jesus, I thought you cracked your skull. He sat down, catching his breath. We should head back tomorrow. Get you looked at. Nate, seriously, I just fainted. Well, you were out for like 2 hours. I'm not a doctor, and I can't do a concussion test or whatever, but you hit your head hard, and I definitely don't think you should be thrashing around the bush with a concussion. Have you ever even fainted before? We can't leave, okay? I'm fine. I tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea knocked me back down. Shit. Maybe I wasn't quite fine. Nate frowned, looking worried. Or not. You need to see a doctor. I can see a doctor when if we get back. What's that supposed to mean? I fainted because I felt him, Nate. Murrum. He knows I'm here. I think I can remember something, but my head is still fuzzy. I'm not concussed. I cut off his comment before he could even make it. It's Murrum. Maybe it's the door. I can hear him, or it, whispering to me. I remember it from when I was a kid in that other place. It messes with my head. I felt like I knew, with a kind of vague certainty that lacked specific details. Some things I hadn't before. I fainted. I knew we were on the right track, for one, and I knew we weren't safe, especially in the dark, the time of the shadows, when Murrum and other hideous things could move more freely. And as soon as I managed to come back to consciousness more, and the whispering subsided, I started to remember again. We wouldn't be able to sleep comfortably that night. Keep the fire going, Nate. We're not safe in the dark. Murrum will wait for me to come back to the door, but there are worse things in the shadows than him. I ran. The monstrous black thing that was Murrum roared with a manic laughter, chasing me further into the forest, herding me. I realized with 20 years of hindsight, further away from my world, further across the bridge towards the door. All around me, gigantic worms and millipedes and centipedes crawled, opening like a parted sea as I ran. I was crying and I could hardly breathe, but some ancient sense kept me running from Murrum. And over my head, the moon looked huge, and it illuminated huge winged creatures. Amongst the trees, I saw thousands of eyes, hungry, but restrained by something I could feel but not see, hiding themselves from whatever I was running towards. I knew they were hiding because I could somehow sense that too. I could sense an energy, horrid and alien. I could sense their fear. But I had nowhere else to go, and with Murrum still roaring behind me, I knew that he wanted me to run, but I also knew if he caught me, I would die, or worse. I could feel the whispering in my head, like a physical symptom or something, like a headache, and then, suddenly, it felt quiet. My head still felt full, pulsating, but the whispering stopped. I had gone too far, and the whispering was afraid they would hear it. Around me, the night had been replaced by an impossible light. Massive, gnarled trees reached high into the still, dark sky, the moon either gone or hidden somehow. And beneath my feet, creatures crawled beneath thick moss, stained red with a oozing fluid, and suddenly I knew what came next, even if I didn't remember the pieces in between. I looked up, down a pathway between the trees, and the shadows shifted menacingly around them. I knew that I would follow that path, that I would fall into the bloody, oozing moss, and that I would soon be face to face with a shadowy thing, soon be hiding under those immense tree roots as it hunted me. I had passed through the barrier into the place I dreamt about. I had crossed through the door. Just like I'd figured, we didn't get much sleep. Beyond the light of the fire, things moved, and I could never tell if they were a trick of the light or something more real. And did the cracking of twigs come from the brush around us, or from the wood popping on the fire? The rising sun came as a relief, especially after spending the whole night mulling over my newest unlocked memory, trying to jolt more pieces of the puzzle free in my mind. We packed up camp and moved on, Nate reluctant but unable to sway my determination. In truth, my head still throbbed, and I don't think the strange sense of whispering fullness could be totally blamed. The bush had calmed, seemingly normal after the nocturnal activity, but as we walked north, I realized that it was still silent. Not the normal silence of these deep, damp ancient forests either. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, as though the world was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. Almost surprisingly, the day passed without incident. We hiked further and further north, into the bush that grew increasingly thick and wild. The land began to trend uphill, and we soon began to head up quite a decent mountain, a long, upward slope towards a higher line of ridges. We reached the top towards the end of the day, and were greeted by a far steeper drop on the other side. The length of the trek up had given us a false impression of how high we were, but we could still see right over the valley on the other side, where both wild rivers cut through the swathes of thick green. Into the south, over the other side of the Gordon River, birds still wheeled about above the treetops. The canopies stirred in the wind, and the forest felt very much alive. All around us, though, the forest sat dead still. No birds flew over the canopy, and not a single leaf stirred in the flat air. This part of the world seemed empty, abandoned even by the winds. To the north, more mountains pushed their way over the green carpet, and I felt a shadow over them. In fact, the more I looked, the more I became convinced there was a darkness hanging there, despite the cloudless sky. Nate decided we should camp for the night before the sun set. Not far along the ridge we came to a rocky outcrop that would help provide us with some protection, and decided that we would camp there. The rock would keep the fire from being visible from the valley below. And for the second night in a row, we found sleep hard to come by. This time, nothing moved around us, but the forest below the ridge came to life when the sun went down. All through the night, we could hear strange voices carrying on the still air. The movement of large things and the cries of creatures I had never heard before. In those valleys, I realized our world and everything we had known had been replaced by another. In the distance, once I could have sworn I heard the dark, twisted voice of Murrum echoing off the mountains. I felt him, though, him and his army of shadows, the whispering in my head, and somewhere out there in the dark they were waiting for me. The things that hunt, the things that scream, the things that slash and bite,
The things that hate, the things that team, the things that bring the night.
I woke with a start, Murrum's black voice echoing through my mind. Had it been real? Shit! Was Murrum standing outside the tent? I panicked for a moment, waking Nate and tangling myself in a sleeping bag before realizing the sun had risen. That didn't mean Murrum couldn't be out there, but somehow I knew he wouldn't give up the advantage of the night like that. His rhyme, the continuation of the one the scientist had been repeating over and over before the massacre, stayed in my head for the entire trek down the mountain. The hike took a lot out of us, sleep-deprived and well out of our depth, the deep gradient of the descent causing leg and back muscles to scream in protest. But we struggled on, down the heavily wooded slope and into the thick, mossy forest below, driven by something neither of us could even quite explain. As we crossed from the more exposed bushland on the mountain into the valley below, a darkness fell over us that had very little to do with the thicker vegetation. The forest felt cold and alien, a chill that transcended a physical sensation and seeped into my core. Even the trees around us seemed different, twisted and contorted as though in agony, and the moss that draped the low branches hung limp and lifeless. We'd only gone a few 100 meters into the foreboding darkness beneath the trees when I started to hear the whispering of Murrum's shadows and feel their thrumming energy in my head. A flash of memory, shadows boiling around us as I ran through a red-stained forest, whispering, filling my head like they were now. I looked around with a newfound horror, realizing what the whispers meant, even if I couldn't see it. The shadow things were all around us. And with an almost physical ache at the thought of doing anything but running, I forced myself to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Nate didn't seem as affected by the whispering voices, and I knew that then they had been with us pretty much the whole time, and so we'd lost all hope of leaving undetected anyway. We trudged through the dark, foreboding forest for hours, our instincts growing more and more frantic and cutting our pace down to a crawl. And then, suddenly, and despite the rare shafts of sunlight piercing the gloom around us, indicating that it was still very much daylight, I happened to glance up and see a black, starlit sky. All at once, my subconscious mind went into haywire. I had seen this before. At the other end of a small clearing, a dark mass rose from the ground and oozed out from between the trees. I grabbed Nate by the hand and stopped his metronomic march forward as Murrum, the pilot fish that swam before the door, coalesced out of the shadows in front of us. Run! Everything seemed to happen so fast, but I remembered it in pieces. Nate said the things I remembered as taking mere moments were like a highlights package of an afternoon spent running. We cowered in a thick patch of ancient green ferns, having fled just far enough before the wicked scout found form. Nate looked shell-shocked, struggling with the fact that the madness in my memories had come to life in front of him. His black voice echoed through the forest around us, twisted laughter at first, then bellowing in a language we couldn't understand. And finally, I heard him in my head.
Hide where you like, little things. My hunters will find you.
There was a sound like muffled thunder, a crackling electric energy in the air, and I peered out from our shelter amongst the ferns. Along the barely discernible path through the forest, I could see shadows flit around the handful of patches where the sun still held sway, and behind them, walking down the path, came a monstrous, dark thing. Easily 4 or 5 meters tall, Murrum walked like something real, but his shape seemed to constantly shift like liquid darkness. The only thing that seemed to stay in one place were his eyes, those terrible points of malicious purple light. Murrum had thousands of years of pent-up hatred, and those eyes expressed every single bit of it. Behind him, 12 smaller figures trailed in his wake.
I was a man once, before the old things, before that abysmal thing they call the messenger. I was a hunter. I was a leader of the hunt. Do you know what it means to lead a hunt, little things? I have not forgotten. My people abandoned me to my fate, and they deserve to share in it, as do you.
The figures behind him fanned out, and I could see that they were human, or at least humanoid. They looked like twisted versions of men, formed from the same liquid shadow as Murrum, and they held an assortment of weapons. Obsidian black spears and evil-looking clubs, mostly.
My people were not the only ones to suffer because of the gateway. For centuries, the messenger hunted the blood moon and took his toll for the old things. One of 6, always the best. Those stolen hunters are now mine to lead, hunters formed of hatred and shadow. I smell you, little one. You will not escape the 4 this time. I will see you dragged back through the gateway to face them.
With that, he made a guttural barking sound and, with unbelievable speed, the twisted shadows surrounding him shot off through the forest. They tore through the air above us like wraiths, causing us to drop right back into the leaf matter beneath the ferns. The horrid shadow men made a thrumming, tearing noise as they whipped over our heads. One dropped to the ground maybe 15 meters away, so instant that it looked as though it had spliced into a film. With no other option, Nate and I stood and ran. Behind us came a snapping sound. A black spear flew just past my shoulder, crackling with energy. Fuck! The hunter clearly had a spear thrower. If I hadn't stepped down a slight depression, that spear would have been buried deep into my right shoulder. And I got the feeling that that would be the end of the road. I also got the feeling I wouldn't be lucky twice. I snapped right, hoping Nate would follow, but too scared to check. It seemed hopeless. The hunters were otherworldly, fast and able to move in a way that we couldn't. A sense of despair fell upon me. Deeper than that moment, something dredged up from the distant past. I'd been in this position before, run from this before, and it seemed that this time I wouldn't be getting away. And just as I started to think about giving up, a shape rose ahead of me. I thought it must be a hunter lying in wait, but as it stood, I realized it was a person. Apart from a heavy cloak, I could make nothing out. The figure gestured frantically, taking my arm as I careened to a near stop. Behind me, I could hear the strange tearing sound of the hunter, creating a terrible concert with the thrumming in my head. While in front, a strange figure, unidentifiable beneath a black cloak. I hardly felt I had a real choice, and I followed the cloaked figure as it dragged me deeper into a thick, mossy section of the forest. Nate's footfalls behind me, reassuring me that he had at least made it this far with me. A few long minutes later, and the cloaked stranger dragged me into a large fallen tree trunk. It lay on its side in a rotting pile, the hollow opening almost like a cave, and the moss so thick that the rest of the log was impossible to make out amongst the green carpet. Curtains of yellowish-white moss obscured the entrance until we were almost upon it. Inside, the air smelt dank and damp, and I had to stoop. Nate, being even taller, hunched over like a parent in a kid's cubby. A small fire glowed towards the back of the hollow. My lungs burned, words impossible to even contemplate until I caught my breath, but our apparent saviour didn't seem to mind. A shift of the hood revealed her as a woman, indigenous and somehow oddly familiar. But I didn't get a chance to think about it before she gestured for us to stay and ducked back through the moss. She came back only a few moments later and hung something in a notch at the entrance to the cavern, something knotted in a dark leather cord. Then she turned to Nate and I and spoke in uncertain, heavily accented English. "We will be safe here. The Moran will grow frustrated when his hunters cannot find you. Even after thousands of years, he is impulsive and erratic. And when he recalls the hunters, we must flee. What you seek is not here. Not yet." Oh, I had so many questions. Who was she? And how did she know any of this? Why had she saved us? Nate jumped in before I could even process my own thoughts. "What? What was that you hung up there? How would that keep us safe from those things?" "It is a fragment, something of power. It deters lesser beings like the hunters. They cannot sense anything beyond it." She turned to look at me. Her face caught the light and all of a sudden the questions fell from my mind. Her eyes caught my attention first. Milky, but not blind. Her cheekbones were heavy and her brow seemed to knot above her eyes. Certainty bloomed clear in my mind, and I knew why she looked so familiar, where I had seen her before. The woman standing in front of me was the woman from my dreams, the one who had guided me through that horrible place as a child. All at once, the memories hit me like a cyclone as I looked into those milky eyes. I remembered everything, the flashes I had already recovered and the vast swathes of missing pieces. In a single moment, everything that had happened to me and the unbelievable terror, raw and all-consuming. The endless and immeasurable time spent running, hiding, soaked in the foul blood that seeped from the horrific trees. The living shadows, the carnivorous mockeries of the familiar creatures, ravenous from centuries of hunger. And the myriad of nightmarish entities so alien and unnatural that they threatened to undo my fragile sanity. The inconceivable face of the slumbering god coiled and waiting, waking. I stumbled back and fell against the tree, eyes locked on those milky orbs, the damp and rotting wood giving way beneath me. My mind tore open and, with every piece of my soul, I began to scream. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. Forest of the Four Kings. Let's get straight into that. I woke up in a motel room. I don't know how I woke up. I don't know how I woke up sane. The blinds were drawn and the blankets hung over the curtain rail to block out even more light. I could hear whispers from another part of the room. The near-muted drone of a television. Oh, my head felt like it had split open and been poorly stitched back together. Images filled that pounding space. Horrifying and impossible but real all the same. I curled into the best ball I could and sobbed. A gentle hand touched my head, a weight sinking onto the bed beside me. I could tell it was Nate, although he didn't speak. I'm not sure he felt like he could speak. What do you say to someone who's clearly losing her mind? But his hand on my head and then my shoulder proved to be a small gesture that started to bring me back. I remembered him practically carrying me out of that abysmal forest. I remember the trip back down the river, floating with the current, while he alternated between steering us clear of obstacles and holding me in the kayak. He sat there for an age, silent, hand on my shoulder, until eventually I reached up and grasped it. I squeezed it so hard I heard a crack, but he never complained. He just sat there, close and comforting, while I fell apart. 2, maybe 3 hours later, maybe even longer, I felt like I had started to wrestle myself back into the barest kind of control over my own mind. I couldn't stop the memories that played over and again, but I could at least tune them out a little. Darkness had fallen by the time I managed to speak, and even then, it took all of my energy to ask Nate for a drink of water. When he brought me the glass, I noticed her sitting on a chair in the corner of the motel room, milky eyes watching me. I couldn't help but shrink away. Nate put his arm around me and reassuringly said we had nothing to fear from her. He wanted to know what I remembered, but I couldn't tell him. I couldn't talk about it, not just then. The nameless woman stepped in then, and she offered to briefly fill Nate in on the story as she remembered it, and I didn't stop her. You may call me Lilith. It is not my birth name, but I learned it after my time beyond the gate, and I believe it is more fitting. I did not expect you to have such a reaction to seeing me again. I am sorry. I was not sure you would even remember me. I had hoped you would not, and that you were being guided to the door by some forgotten instinct rather than a true memory of that place. And sadly, it seems that I was wrong. I was taken through the gates by a creature called Imbic many, many years ago. And to those that created it, the servants of the Four Kings, the gate is known as the Feral Lane. Like so many of its brethren over the centuries, Imbic slipped through the Feral Lane for no other reason than to spread evil. It stole me from my people and carried me through the Feral Lane and into its world. Imbic would turn his victims into husks, vessels to be filled by essence of the zealots, and sent back through the gate. In truth, empty shells inhabited by the life force of a zealot, a simple, childlike thing that exists only to serve the old things. But I'm getting away from myself. I managed to escape from Imbic, but I could not find my way back through the Feral Lane. The opening attracts all sorts of creatures, crowding the door, waiting for it to be fully opened so that they may pass through and carry out their misery in this world. They are resentful of us. This world used by theirs, long before life as we know it rose. The energies that created this world created the Four Kings. In turn, the powerful and pitiless kings created minions. Minions they used to fight wars and shape the world around them to their perversions. These minions are creatures like Imbic, the old things, the things that our distant ancestors huddled from when darkness fell. But they overstepped. They drained this world of the energy that created them and doomed themselves. The Four Kings could no longer live in this world, nor could their minions. They came together and put aside their quarrels, using the last of their power to create the Feral Lane, a doorway to a world where they could access the ancient energies that fed them. Some called their new world Raleon, although it has many, many names. Over the centuries, they retreated through the Feral Lane more and more until, eventually, they fell into a state of hibernation. When this happened, the power that kept the Feral Lane truly open diminished, trapping most of the old things within Raleon. And again, I'm getting away from my story. I existed within Raleon, amongst the old things, for centuries. I hid with the crawling creatures amongst the crevices of the forests. My mind broke quite quickly, and I became little more than another crawling animal hiding from the monstrous things around me. Even without the attention of the old things, the world itself began to change me. After all, the hunters were once people, just like me, twisted by Raleon and the old things. But then, my dear, I saw you. A child in Raleon, standing in a clearing just outside the garden of the Four Kings, alone. I saw your fear and your confusion, and something in me remembered humanity. I had never had the chance to bear children of my own, and perhaps that instinct and longing was strong enough to repair my broken mind somewhat. While I watched, something came through the trees behind you. It was one of the old things, the shadow hound, called Entes. Few of the old things have any regard for humanity, and Entes is among the worst. You saw the beast and ran under the root system of one of the giant trees. I knew Entes would follow, and that he would take you, and so I burrowed under the moss that forms the forest floor and made my way towards you. I managed to reach you before Entes did and snatched you away into the subterranean world. But we were not safe. Entes hounded us above until I reached my sanctuary. Do you remember? The hollowed-out tunnels underneath the forest, in the caverns where we huddled near the black artifact. The fragment I used to protect us from Murum comes from that place. I stole it from the garden, a piece of a weapon used in the ancient wars between kings. The energies used to forge it are designed to oppose the energies that feed the kings and their minions. The old things do not have the strength to approach it. Only the hibernating kings can abide it. That artifact kept us safe from Entes and any other creatures that sought us. I am sorry. I keep losing track of where I am. My mind is not what it should be, and these memories are jumbled. There is so much to tell, so much to explain, and so little time. I fed you on what meager edibles could be found and kept you safe within the tunnels for many days. Insofar as the term has meaning beyond the Farrelin. There are creatures that will harm a person, even out of the sight of the old things, and I fought them off as best I could. But eventually I knew I would fail, and you would be taken by some vile predator. Or worse, I knew I had only one option. I could not send you back, though. The Farrelin, and although it would be a mercy, I could not end your life myself. What I decided to do may have been much worse. Within the Garden of the Four Kings is a stone structure, much like your Stonehenge, called the Pillars of Arl. It is one of the very few places where powerful creatures such as the Messenger can open a small pathway to your world without having to open the Farrelin. It was said that the Pillars of the Arl were possessed of an energy that would allow creatures from outside Raleigh to return home. I had been there once before and failed, but I had to try. But the garden is no place for humans, much less a child. It is the place where the kings slumber and where their energy is most keenly felt, and therefore the worst place within the hell that is Raleigh. To take you there would mean exposing you to the things that may well have destroyed you. Or even if I managed to send you home, you may not have even been human by the time you arrived. I took you to the garden. Forgive me, but I did. I only hoped to return you home. The journey was long, and there were many times I felt that we would not make it another step, despite the protection of the fragment around our necks. The things that live in the garden are not simply minions of the kings. They are the most powerful of the old things, the oldest and most pitiless guardians who walk the garden while the kings slumber. I will spare you the trauma of reliving that nightmare. It must have been another month before we reached the pillars. By this time, you had retreated into yourself entirely, unable to speak or respond to me in any way. I feared the worst, but I continued. As it happened, the worst was still to come. We reached the pillars, but we were not alone. In trying to find a safe place to hide from the creature that blocked our way, I made a hasty decision and stumbled upon a resting place of one of the four kings. The sight of it seemed to cause a complete collapse in your state of mind. You began behaving like a trapped animal, wailing and scratching and attacking me in an effort to get free. Even in hibernation, I could feel its presence. It probed at my mind with an unnatural and ancient power. I could feel my madness returning. I ran. I dragged you back to the pillars. I didn't even think about the creature that had lurked there and sent us fleeing into the jaws of the sleeping king. I just needed to get away. Part of me accepted that death would be preferable to whatever that terrible god might have for us, even in its hibernation. We managed to approach the pillars from the opposite side. The creature noticed us, of course, but too slowly. The pillars of Aal, or whatever leftover energy remained from your world, dragged us into a swirling light. I believe that you activated it unknowingly. Your energy had no place in Rylaion. You had not been marked by the old things, nor had you been tainted, yet, by long-term exposure. The stories the lesser things used to tell about the pillars indicated that they could return something to the world where it rightly belonged. And an innocent child rightly belonged here. And you somehow dragged me with you. When we arrived in this world, you had fallen into a deep sleep. I was worried you had not survived, but you were breathing. Happily, we came through the pillars deep in the forest. Your world had changed so much since I left it, as I would find over the years, but I knew the forest. I took you to the river and washed you, and dressed you in the clothes you arrived in through the farrow lane. I washed myself for the first time in so long, and then I carried you through the forest. You did not stir, even as night came and went. 2 days you slept before I came upon what I now know to have been a camper van. All that mattered to me was that there was people who could help you. But I could not speak your language. I had no clothes, no clue what the world had become, and my sanity was not yet fully returned. I did not even recognize them as people, not really. If not for your skin being similar in color to theirs, I doubt I would have given you to them. I am glad I did. We hid near the camp until you began to waken. Then I slipped into the shadows and waited, ready to steer you in the right direction. You didn't need it. I think you were still confused, perhaps as a result of the experience. You shuffled into the clearing, and a white-haired lady scooped you up. Nobody ever saw me, and I vanished into the forest and never expected to see you again. I realized, somewhere around the time Lilith spoke about seeing me in the clearing, that I'd started to cry. A soundless, almost involuntary flow of tears ran down my face as the memories matched up with her brief telling of the story. Or, worse, when my own memories exceeded the detail Lilith went into. It told me its name. I whispered it, to myself mostly, and Lilith and Nate didn't hear it. Nate was too busy trying to wrap his head around the tiny fraction of the story that Lilith had told him. Wait, you were talking weeks and months, but Caitlin was only missing for 5 days? And you had been there for centuries? What does that mean? Our time is different through the farrow lane. I am not of your world, with its sciences, and I cannot explain it, but I know it to be true. As for me, the energies that help the old things to survive also affect us. You will not die of hunger, or thirst, or cold while in their world, but you will feel them. Eventually, I had to eat, no matter how foul the options, just so that I could feel full. This stuff all seemed irrelevant to me. I didn't care how or why. I just cared that it was real, that it happened. I tuned them out, fixating on the sensation of sheer horror I felt at the memory of what the sick and ancient god had said to me. It told me its name. It told me it was already awake. Sometime later, Nate went out to get some food. I had been out of it for days and I needed to eat, and there was a takeaway joint just down the road from the motel. This left me alone with Lilith, something that still unnerved me. I associated her with the place beyond the door, and I didn't like being around her. Her story had been accurate, and I knew the way I felt wasn't fair to her. She'd saved me from something inconceivable, but all I could think about was how heavily she featured in it. Still, she spoke to me. I had no choice but to listen. I know it's traumatic. You are living something you had forgotten all over again. Your spirit tried to protect you, but your mind was too curious. That is natural. You could have not known the pain it would have caused, but you need to fight it, because where you once needed me, I now need you. And she squeezed my hand and I flinched, but I didn't withdraw it. There are so few who have left and know of the Farrelane and what lies beyond. So few who can see the danger. If the door opens and the four kings awaken, the world as we know it will change. Slowly at first, but more and more as their influence spreads. Our world will begin to resemble theirs in subtle but horrific ways. If the door is open long enough or the wrong things make it through, it will never recover. Lilith looked tremendously sad, like she had the weight of an entire world on her shoulders, and I realized in that moment that maybe she did. She had been spat out into a world that she no longer knew, cold and alone and utterly out of place when she brought me back. And pushing my suddenly ingrained fear aside, I put an arm around her, something she clearly wasn't used to. There is a reason I am telling you this, and you alone. I have found a way to block the Farrelane. It is an ancient ritual, older even than my own people. The door is nearing a cosmic peak where energies far beyond our experience will allow it to open fully. And there is a ritual that can counteract those energies for a time. To put it in context of your world, this ritual acts as a doorstop of sorts. If the door does not open, the four kings will not wake until the next peak allows it to. Although we will need your friend, it is you I must convince. The ritual must be performed within the gap between this world and the other side of the Farrelane. The world of Murum, the shadows, and the messenger. Where the elder met Yanala by the light of the moon. You are the one who has experienced the sickness of their world. You understand the danger, but you also understand what may happen, what we will encounter, and what we must endure. I cannot ask you to help me without knowing that you may go through even worse horrors than you have already previously been through. At that point, Nate returned with 3 burgers from the takeaway and a mixture of chips and potato scallops. He also had 2 6-packs of bogues, and the smell of food hit me and I suddenly realized the full extent of my empty stomach. I didn't even wait for the plate, I just tore into the preferred burger without even remembering to chew properly. Nate had to slow me down before he handed me a beer. It's such a deceptively simple thing. Strength. Nate ignored the mood. He talked to Lilith about our childhood and the good things, not missing the chunk that had been so violently filled. He told her about growing up in a world we did and the stupid things we did as kids. The time that we put a firework in a teacher's letterbox, the time we took home a possum thinking it was a cat, and when we opened up the box we put on the door, the day's thing in it had scratched Nate so badly he needed 14 stitches. The time we snuck into a scary movie and then both of us refused to sleep for a week. The time he dared me to jump off a cubby house and I broke my arm. The time he almost drowned when he fell into the bloody Derwent skateboarding along a pier. The time we stole a half a bottle of vodka and spent half an hour pretending to drink it because it burned so badly, only to realize that the level had stayed the same the whole time. All the stupid moments that make up a good childhood. The energy of my first meal in days and the warmth of the memories Nate brought up so enthusiastically helped fight down some of the shattering smallness I had felt in the face of my recovered memories. And for her part, it seemed Lilith had never had alcohol before. 2 beers had her laughing uncontrollably and telling her own stories. I don't know where she had spent the years since our return, but she had obviously missed having company. Obviously, our trip down memory lane couldn't repair everything that the revelations of the last few days had done to my psyche. But it helped. It gave me strength, that fickle quirk of the human spirit that can come and go so easily. Our stories reminded me that the horrors of the world behind that door were only a small part of my life, a life that had otherwise been full of warmth, and they reminded me of the things that the world through the Farrelane could have taken from me, and threatened to take from anyone unfortunate enough to be near when it opened. I still wanted to run, to leave all of this behind and hide as far away as I could, but I knew then that I couldn't do it. I couldn't live with another little girl ending up where I had, with innocent kids losing their childhood to the uncaring evil of the old things as it seeped through the divide between worlds and into their lives. Whatever Lilith needed from me, I would do it. I would help her close the door. I got lost in the bush when I was 8. The river runs red. Let's get straight into that. Some years ago, while living wild until I could learn the ways of the world to replace mine, I stumbled upon the body of a lost hiker. He carried a journal and, upon reading it, it became clear he had lost his sanity. He had been lost badly, and so had wandered for many weeks. Many believe that a man who has parted ways with sanity will be incoherent, but that is generally not the case. The man had written his memories of where he had been. He described hiking, the walls to the lake, but then he became disorientated. For many days he wandered, aimless, never able to define a landmark that might guide him home. Eventually he came to a river that ran red. At this point, he became convinced that he had lost his mind, but what he described was all too familiar to me. The man had perfectly described the very brink of the Farrelane. He had taken his own life, gruesomely, as those who encounter the old things so often do. The Farrelane does not move, nor is it ever in one place or in many, yet all of these things can be true. The simplest way to imagine it is that the entire world is the Farrelane. It is a door between this world and the other, and it can open anywhere. However, there are places that the barriers are stronger, the energies of the world strong enough to override those of the old things. And normally, these are places of strong humanity. It could be said that we are drawn to these places. It could be said that we hide from the places where the Farrelane is strongest. This is a far more complex system than those who encountered it thousands of years ago could ever imagine. During its peak, this will not be true. For as long as it lasts, the Farrelane can open anywhere. There is always one place, however, where the barriers are weakest. Always one place where the Farrelane is most powerful. It will open there during the peak, but it may also open anywhere the barriers can be breached. Even if the door only opens in the remotest of places, it will devastate this world. Things will come through that can move along ancient lines of power, that can manipulate consciousness and even alter reality itself. It will spread. To complete the ritual, we must be where the Farrelane is at its strongest. We must go here, well beyond the walls, to where the river runs red. Lilith had pointed to an area we were currently hiking towards, somewhere between Lake Burberry and the walls of Jerusalem. A massive valley runs from the northern end of Lake Burberry practically all the way to the northern end of Lake St. Clair, on the edge of the walls. It is traversed by many rivers and streams, the most notable being the South Eldon and the Murchison. Like so much of this island, it is a wild country, and the high terrain on the northern edge of the valley is near on impassable in places. This is where we found ourselves, slinking quietly through the forest, following Lilith into what may as well have been the gates to hell. By this time, 2 days had already passed, uneventful, since we stepped away from the shores of the lake and started following the South Eldon River. We travelled light, the rivers and streams flowed pure, and Lilith was so at home in the forest that it honestly seemed she could summon food from the ether. If not for the heavy, silent dread that hung over us, it could have just been a beautiful hike. 4 days in, I saw the ravens, perched in the highest branches of the trees and mostly obscured by the canopy. They watched us pass in uncanny silence. There must have been hundreds of them, and not one made a sound, not a single caw, not even a ruffling of feathers as the bird readjusted its wings. And beyond the quiet burbling of the water flowing downstream, we were surrounded by silence, which only served to emphasize the feeling of so many eyes watching. The others noticed them too, their eyes spending more time looking up at the ground than where we trod, nervous. We eventually came to an area where the banks of the river widened enough to provide an easier path than the one we were forced to create through the bush. And when we stepped out, I could see the birds clearly for the first time. They were not ravens. They had no feathers. Instead, they were covered with patchy fur and their wings looked stunted, like there was no way that they could fly. One of the things I'd seen in my dreams, creatures from beyond the door. And Lilith recognized them with a grim smile. We were getting closer. We spent the night huddled underneath the thick undergrowth, in a place where the smaller plants formed a kind of natural cavern of leaves and shrubs. Around us, as darkness fell, the forest came to life with alien sounds that I had only recently come to know all too well. We had slipped into the space between the barriers, and where the two worlds mixed like rivers meeting. Lilith held the cloth-wrapped shard tight, doing her best to keep us sheltered from whatever horrors found themselves prowling the Farrow Lane that night. I didn't sleep. I can't speak for Lilith or Nate, but I lay there listening to the world around us, feeling the wrongness of it all deep in my gut, until I watched the sun rise slowly in a purple-tinged sky. We ate hasty, early breakfast, and set off as soon as the sun cleared the horizon. I was keenly aware that I didn't belong to this world, not totally, anyway. We were well outside anywhere humans were ever supposed to tread, walking straight into a kind of eddy between worlds. As we walked, I felt it once again, the familiar whispering, the swirling of not quite their shadows as they danced around me. And deep in my chest, somehow both physical and metaphysical, I felt a tightening. Not dread, nor fear, no, worse than that. I felt certainty, inevitability. Today we would find the very cusp of the Farrow Lane. Today we would close it, or die trying. If we were lucky enough to die. I noticed immediately that the forest had begun to change, wilder, darker and deeper. It felt older. Familiar trees stood amongst ancient, twisted things with black bark that ran with rivulets of oily sap. Except I knew it wasn't sap. Between them shadows shifted, alive and waiting for the sun to fall and the night to release them from their darkened prisons beneath the trees. Strange, fronded plants moved in the undergrowth, independent of the breeze. Looking closer, as we ventured further in, I realized that they were being moved by masses of centipedes and huge millipedes. Oh, my skin crawled, remembering the feeling of those many-legged things crawling all over me as I huddled from the great beasts of the ancient world. All around me, the whispers of Murrum's shadows grew louder and hungrier. Nate had fallen silent, dumbstruck by the changes to the landscape as we passed through. Lilith constantly surveyed the surrounding forest, her milky eyes darting quickly in all directions. Each of us digested our situation silently, as the lines between our world and theirs became more and more blurred. Lilith came to a sudden halt, motioning us to stop behind her. In front of us, the path dimmed and the sky darkened, although the forest itself stayed oddly lit despite the darkness above. The ancient trees twisted together far above our heads, knotted together like an obscene skeletal limbs. Our guide veered left onto a smaller path and beckoned us to follow. Leaves from lower branches brushed at us as we passed, giving the impression of a world grasping at us, trying to draw us in. And just as I thought the forest would close around us entirely and seal us in, we broke through to a very different landscape. I found myself staring out over an undulating landscape of long grass, somehow both green and pink, swaying in the absence of any breeze. The sea of grass was broken sporadically by weathered black boulders, and a rugged mountain rose beyond a narrow river that churned a jagged, rocky path through the gently murmuring grasses. A river that ran blood red. The land sloped gently down towards the crimson passage of the river, where it crashed over the sharp, black rocks. Pink foam swirled in eddies and switchbacks as the water weaved its way downstream, if it was water. Lilith didn't hesitate as she pushed her way through the long, thick grass towards the river. I followed quickly, while Nate gawped in a terrified wonder at the scene, his unease not helped in any way by the gigantic old thing that swooped across the sky from the mountain, slithering through the air far above our heads like a huge, impossible worm. He gave me a look of sheer panic, but, to his credit, he slipped into the path Lilith and I had carved through the grass behind us. The grass sliced at my skin, opening tiny cuts that bled freely, and soon my bare arms were stained as red as the river. Nate hissed behind me, slapping at the scratches as they formed, but Lilith seemed oblivious to the tiny rivulets of red that marred her dark skin. On reaching the edge of the water, Lilith turned towards the mountain, and we scrambled our way over sharp rocks to follow. And to our left, a sickly stream crashed against the steep rocky bank barely contained. I slipped on a particularly slick spot, and my heart leapt into my throat as I slid inevitably towards the sanguine waters below. A strong arm around my waist held my fall as Nate came bounding over the rocks. Ahead, Lilith continued, single-minded and oblivious. We closed the distance to the mountain, and I slowly began to realize just how massive it really was. After maybe another hour of walking, it blotted out the entirety of the sky in front of us. Our ancient guide paused at an even more ancient stone bridge, head cocked, listening for something. And even without speaking, I could tell what the look on her face had to say. Where are all the monsters? I hadn't been on the other world anywhere near as long as her, but I knew that the Farallane itself should have been seething with old things and their minions, just waiting for the chance to get through. It made me feel uneasy. As though answering our silent question, a bellowing roar rose over the black forest we'd left behind, and even at that distance, the sheer force it punched me into the lungs and made me miss a breath. On its own turf, the power of the horrific thing that made that sound was palpable. Aeons of rage and hate and madness screeching out over the land like a physical thing. Lilith and I shared a look of tense anxiety, and all three of us turned to see an immense black shadow lift over the trees, crackling with bolts of vivid, violent energy. Murum, the wicked scout, the guardian of the gate. Lilith breathed the word so faintly I could barely hear it, but my body seemed to know exactly what to do before it even crossed her lips. Run! The cavern at the base of the mountain swallowed us just as Murum began to stalk over the grasslands, his shadow hunter swirling around him in an eerie vortex. His manic laughter crackled over the valley as Lilith hung shards at the mouth of the vast cave in a desperate effort to keep the twisted hunters at bay. "Do not concern yourself with Murren for now. We must begin the ritual." She pulled off her pack and began emptying its contents onto the dusty ground, motioning for us to hurry and dig out the supplies she had given us to carry. Then she scurried back towards the rear of the cavern, swallowed by the darkness until she sparked a cigarette lighter and set a flickering light to the scene. I watched the orange glow slowly push back the darkness and gasped at what it revealed. We were in a much larger space than I had thought. The rocky walls of the cavern stretched 4 or 5 stories over our heads, and the body of the room they created must have been several hundred meters from wall to wall. Lilith had set her fire at the feet of a huge statue, many of its features seemingly worn or chipped away, either by the passage of unimaginable time or deliberate act. It stood almost as tall as the roof, although nothing about the form made any sense. There weren't enough limbs in some places and extra limbs in others, and more heads than my mind thought appropriate, but I couldn't fix on a single form. I felt like my brain didn't want me to see it. Not really. The fire spread through the channels on the surface of the statue and almost brought it to life in an eerie way. Lilith looked up at me, the firelight giving her milky eyes an unsettling orange glow. "This is the Hall of Astorcity, the fire of the old things, even older than the kings. And some say Astorcity is even older than this world, a relic of another place and time. In the beginning, many of the old things worshipped it, even though the kings eventually drove it out of this plane. When they created this world, some of the creatures still worshipped. They created this hall, a place where some of the essence of the Astorcity could be invoked. And this essence would disrupt the energies that allow the Farallane to open properly long enough to keep it from doing so." A crash came from the mouth of the cavern, followed by a familiar booming voice, a voice that sounded like black tar and coal, like splintering graphite. An oozing, sinister laugh filled the cavern.
Ants by the river, always wondering, what is this vast, violent expanse that snatches our brothers away, never to be seen again? Always wondering and fated to never understand, to never comprehend the enormity of the things before them.
"The shards!" called Lilith. "The hunters cannot harm me now that the statue has been lit, but they can harm you. The shards will hold them at bay, but not for long. The space is too great. Put the shards around your necks and the hunters cannot touch you."
Oh, little ants, still fighting the river even as it floods.
I snatched the shards of whatever ancient horror Lilith had pried them off of from the wall where they were hanging, and did as she instructed, allowing the swirling shadows to enter the cavern like black lightning. They snapped into focus as they had in the forest before. Men made of pure darkness, brandishing ancient weapons with an eager malice. Somewhere behind us I could hear Lilith chanting something guttural and jarring. In front of us, the shadow hunters stood, livid but unsure, repelled by the objects around our necks. And despite their reluctance, Murren laughed again, his voice emanating from each of the hunters before us in a sick chorus.
Poor ants, wearing pieces of something far beyond them to repel my hunters, but you have misunderstood the situation. My hunters alone may not have the strength to overcome the atrocity you have donned. But my hunters are a piece of me, little ants, and I have no such weakness.
Moving as one, the hunters seemed to break free of a trance as Murren himself flowed into them. Nate and I had the barest moment to share a horrified glance before they howled a single, many-voiced war cry and charged straight for us. The feeling of the shadow hunters flowing over me is still indescribable. They didn't attack us as much as engulf us, seeping into every pore with a sensation of searing cold that choked the air from my lungs. I couldn't even scream, and how I wished I could. Reality had collapsed around me, both my own and the horrific unreality of the world behind the door, and all I felt was hatred, pure, ringing, inhuman hatred like I could never have felt on my own. It twisted in my gut and filled my heart with rage, an unbearable rage at the fact that I existed at all. And with some detached piece of my mind, I realized where it all came from. What I felt was Murum invading my mind and soul, taking me for himself, turning me into one of his instruments, as he had been doing to sacrificial victims for thousands of years. And despite the unbearable agony and the torturous perversion of my sense of self, all I wanted to do was cry. I felt myself slipping away without any fear, but overwhelmed by sorrow at what would become of me when Murum had finished erasing the person I had been. And then, with a final flash of existential terror, everything blinked out. I got lost in the bush when I was 8, closing the door. Let's get straight into that. Consciousness came back slowly, and then, as memory returned, in one panicked flash, I remembered the darkness that had invaded and violated me. I jolted upright, wild, frantically scrambling backwards to get away from the living shadows that I thought had smothered me out of existence, but all I found was cold rock. Nevertheless, I became aware of a presence. An energy filled the room around me, thrumming and pulsating in the darkness, as though the air itself was alive. A strange sensation filled my head, the sense that I need not be afraid, calming me without words. I wondered if I had died and found myself in an afterlife of sorts, and the energy around me seemed amused. I took that to mean I wasn't dead, at least, not yet, anyway. And over an interminable amount of time that may have been minutes or days, I started to gain some understanding of the way the energy that surrounded me in the darkness communicated. And then, as though a light switch had been flicked on, I understood it perfectly.
Good, little one. I did not know whether your mind will be able to perceive me as I am.
I didn't speak exactly, yet it conveyed its meaning perfectly.
Your companion has invoked the power of Astosity. The dark instrument of the usurpers cannot harm you now.
Questions entered my mind unbidden.
No, strange one. Astosity has long since left this world and any others. I am merely a shade, a portion of its energy imbued into the idol. I cannot answer your questions, nor could you understand if I were able. I am simply what has been left behind, to keep the idol safe from the wretched things that have taken over this world in the absence of the creators.
But then, if this entity wasn't Astosity, why had it chosen to speak to me at all?
Astosity was a curious being, vastly powerful and hungry for knowledge. I suppose that as my creator, it must have imprinted some of that upon me. You are a curiosity, something I have never encountered. Lighting the idol for the first time in an uncountable generations. I simply sought to understand the creatures that had awoken me before I returned to slumber. A strange creature you are, no matter for the scrabbling vermin that have filled the void left in this world, and yet determined to fight them all the same. The creators would have admired your courage, if nothing else.
And with that, the energy seemed to shift, chilling the dark space even further.
Ah, the dark things draw near, little creature.
It is time for you to go. And suddenly, I woke up, and for real this time, to warmth and a rocking sensation. I groggily realized that Nate was cradling me, sobbing into my neck and whispering something. "Please, Caitlin, please." I stirred and he gasped, looking at me in the eyes, his own red and watering. "Oh my God, Caitlin, you were... I thought... Oh my God." He clutched me tight, so tight that I found it hard to breathe and I had to squirm free. I murmured something about being okay, looking towards Lilith, and she chanted something in a harsh language. It hurt my ears and gave me an uncomfortable feeling in my gut. Nate gathered himself somewhat, wiping his eyes and gesturing towards her. "She's been at it for ages. Every now and again the statue flashes like it's responding to her somehow." My voice didn't really want to work, but I managed to rasp out my other question. "Murum?" "Lilith did something, I think. Him and his fucking monsters. It just kind of blew away like smoke. I was just about gone, though. I thought, well, I thought you were." I didn't feel like this was the best time to tell him that I did too. I still wonder if maybe I was, for a time. Whatever might have happened, Murum couldn't get to us anymore. And while Lilith chanted away at the mind-bending idol of ostosity, I slipped my hand into Nate's and took some time to gather my thoughts. Sometime later, Lilith stopped chanting. The idol now stood fully lit, glowing with both fire and some internal light, its form still inconceivable to my eyes. Lilith slumped to her knees with an exhaustion and motioned us to get closer. "The first half of the ritual is complete, but we have very little time. I sense the kings themselves are moving to stop us, and if we are still beyond the Farallane when they find us, we will wish for the comforts of your Christian hell. It is time to move. The ritual must be completed on the bridge between the worlds, in the center of the gate." Nate and I helped her to her feet, and together we supported her out of the cave and into the awful light of the world outside. I expected to find the path in the field of razor-sharp grass beyond the Red River, crawling with old things in their vessels. But, to my surprise, we were unmolested as we retraced our steps. My skin burned with 1,000 paper cuts, and the feeling of the oily, hate-filled blackness that was Murum still lingered on me, physically and psychologically. I think I'd mostly checked out, if I'm honest, shut down and accepted that I wouldn't escape a second time, and that the old things and the creatures of their world would make sure I never left. I expected death, and my mind had already started to close off in preparation. In real life, plucky humans don't heroically defeat evil forces beyond their understanding. They heroically die, and the darkness that gave their lives to defeat barely flinches. Knowing that, I almost felt a strange kind of relief as we plunged back into the leading edge of the fetid, blood-soaked forest, and the shadows boiled to life around us. Hundreds of twisted creatures launching themselves from their lair in the darkness in an effort to stop us. Things that I had watched curiously as we passed previously now roared into life. Bigger versions of the bird-like creatures that sat in the high branches, and strange, chitinous creatures and things with too many limbs that screeched and clicked as they darted out from under tree roots and inside hollows. And there were four-legged, snarling things caught partway in decay, their fur toughed and patchy, flesh drooping off their faces to exposed tooth and jaw. I watched it all in a disconnected daze. This was it, I thought. This was where I died. "Run!" screamed Lilith, carving a trail through the carpet of many-legged crawlers as she bolted down an ancient forest path towards the point where their worlds met ours. And with some shock, I realized my body obeyed her, while my mind watched on from somewhere else. I saw myself run, Nate pushing me in front of himself. I saw the horrid creatures surge after us like a wave, living and deadly. I saw the beast that loomed over them all, massive and dark, its bestial laughter echoing amongst the sticky trees, and I remembered it from my very first hours in this awful place all those years ago. The shadow hound, Entes, had let me slip away once. I doubted it would let it happen again. As though I was watching a dream, I saw the sea of creatures part as the monstrous form of Entes stalked us, calm and deliberate. I felt a thrill it felt as it loosed a guttural howl and set itself on our trail. I watched from somewhere else as I turned back to see it, eyes wide and face white. I watched myself stumble and crash to the ground. The flash of pain as my ankle broke, no more than a distant inconvenience. I watched Nate skid to a stop at my side, reaching down to try and help me up, ignorant of the horror that would fall on us at any moment. He screamed to Lilith, and the sheer desperation in his voice snapped me back into my body. Full and total awareness rushed back to me, the pain in my ankle forcing the air from my lungs with a sharp sob. I could see that I wouldn't be going anywhere fast, my foot limp and useless. I looked back past Nate towards Entes, who had stopped, eyeing us almost leisurely with a triumphant look of a victorious predator. I wished I had stayed away, wherever my mind had been, because I knew what would happen now. I would tell Nate to run, to leave me behind, and he would, or he wouldn't, but either way the pain in my ankle would be nothing compared to what I would feel for those last moments as Entes tore me apart. I hoped that he would run, but from the way he tried to pick me up and drag me clumsily down the path, I thought we'd probably both die right there. And behind us, Entes shifted, ready to pounce. I felt surprisingly calm. I dreaded the pain, of course, but I knew it would end. And just as I tried to struggle free from Nate's grip and tell him to leave me behind, I saw a dark figure slip back past us. Lilith. She placed herself between Entes and the two of us, and I realized that we must have passed into the blurred zone between the two worlds during our flight. Above me, the branches were heavy with bald crows that seemed to mark the place where the worlds mixed. The trees no longer wept their heavy red tears, and the ground below was free of the masses of crawling things that were ubiquitous to the forest of the kings. Lilith turned to us as Entes chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that filled the forest. I noticed for the first time that she had stripped naked, her skin daubed with her own blood, manipulated into odd patterns and sigils by her own fingers. I'd been so checked out that I'm not sure when she did it. I suppose back at the cave. I wanted to scream at her. She had to finish the ritual, not die with us. I didn't understand why she would risk failing, instead of fleeing to finish what we came to do. And she now stood within reach of the shadow hound, without any hope to escape. And within seconds, he would pounce. I am sorry, child. I could not tell you what the ritual entailed. Her smile was sad, but satisfied. Just know that it is done, for you and for your world. And know that I no longer belong there with you. This is what I must do, and I am happy to be the one to do it. And with that, and before I could process her words or respond in any way, she drew her hand to her throat. And too late I realized she held a piece of obsidian in her hand, razor sharp and black. A line of blood appeared across her throat as Entes launched, turning into a dark red torrent as the wound opened. Her eyes glowed with the same light the idol in the cave had, and then her body folded to the ground. Entes missed a clean strike as a result, but his jaw still closed over her upper half. I screamed, an outpouring of shock and grief that surprised me with its force, and there came a loud sound, like a metal on stone, persistent and painful to the ear. I watched Entes tear Lilith in half at the waist and fix his eyes on me. But, before he had a chance to strike, the world went mad. I felt like I had been thrown into a broken DVD. The world around me seemed to flash in and out of existence, skipping and chopping and twisting in ways I still don't understand, like the skipping of corrupted scenes in a movie. The metallic grating sound reached a shrieking crescendo. Entes himself distorted as though viewed through a novelty lens, and then, suddenly, it all stopped. Utter silence fell upon us. All around us there was nothing but forest, familiar bush that smelled and tasted like home. The hideous creatures had vanished. The door had been closed. 5 weeks later, I sat on my back patio with Nate, looking out over the dark garden and the Brindabella Mountains beyond. The hike out to the walls of Jericho had been agony. Days and nights spent slogging through the thick wilderness with a poorly splintered leg. As soon as we reached the lake and the gear we had stashed, Nate radioed for help. We were still so remote that we waited another night for an emergency helicopter. We didn't speak until we made it back to Hobart. I needed surgery to repair the broken ankle. Otherwise, I would have flown out to Tasmania that very day. I had yet to go back to work. Apart from the moon boot, my therapist had given me an indefinite leave to deal with the memories that had surfaced, although I quite obviously didn't tell her anything close to the full story. I still had nightmares. I mourned the woman who had saved me twice, and I still felt unbelievably frail. But Nate being around helped. If anything, he was more affected than me, more shell-shocked by what we had been through, but I think we helped each other stay sane. I was starting out on the road to recovery, even if I knew that process might ultimately take years or decades. There were still so many things I didn't understand about Lilith, about the Farallane and the world beyond, about whatever Lilith had done to close the door. I wish I knew more, but from the moment we met Lilith, Nate and I were no more than companions to her as she fulfilled her own story. She held so much more back than she ever told us. I had followed my own story to her, and she had taken over and finished the journey I had started. Except, even that isn't all true. We're back at the beginning of this whole insane mess. I told you I should never have started down this path. I had nothing to do with the toll it took on me. That night, sitting on the patio, the moon suddenly became brighter, as though a cloud had cleared. It looked way too big in the sky, and a chill ran through me. In the garden, a shadow seemed to form, whirling and coalescing into something solid, something that filled me with incomprehensible dread, something huge and black and with 4 horns. The air began to buzz around us, and I turned to Nate but found that he had vanished, and that's when I really panicked. And then the voice of Yanala filled my head, the messenger of the 4 kings.
How easily the lesser creatures are manipulated.
The creature turned to face me, frozen in the deck chair, and seemed to shake its head. I felt a wave of pity wash over me, the kind of pity you might feel for a mouse flattened in a trap.
Your kind are weak, infirm of spirit and unwise of mind. The old things know this well. They know that in order to shape this world once more, the door must be opened in a more agreeable place. A place of greater power than the previous pathway. A place where we can touch more of your kind. The weaker places must be closed, so that more energy can be poured into the correct breach. In this way, the old things can more readily shape this world in their image.
What did that mean? It hit me in an instant, sucking the wind out of my lungs.
The weaker places must be closed.
Lilith had said that the Farallane wasn't exactly a spot, nor was it many. Rather, the entire Earth acted as part of the door. The flow of energies against each other created weaker and stronger places in the barriers. We hadn't closed the door at all. We just patched the greatest weakness. And much like patching one leak out of many, that would change the pressure on others. Without that weak spot, the energies would be redirected, creating new weaknesses. Instead of opening in the middle of the wilderness, the door would now open elsewhere, closer to where the old things wanted it to open. Maybe in one place, maybe in many, as the world beyond poured through smaller breaches instead of one weak place. The messenger had come to taunt me. As though sensing my epiphany, the thing standing in my garden started to laugh. A gentle laugh, but one dripping with a cold, compassionless apathy. In some ways, that felt worse than evil. The messenger had the same feelings towards humanity as I might have fly. Yanala faded, and the world around me returned to normal, and so did one final memory. The memory of the words an ancient god planted in my head as a child in the garden.
Do not fret, tiny one. We have great plans for you. I am Belekor, third of the kings. We are awake. We are ready. All we must do now is to ensure the door opens in the appropriate place. The world we once ruled will be ours again, however briefly. And you, my little one, will be the key that opens the door and brings us home.
We failed. Worse than that, I was always fated to fail. Everything I went through, everything that happened, had been plotted out by ancient beings far more powerful than any of us. I escaped because they needed me to escape. I forgot because they made me forget, and I remembered because the time had come for me to remember. The kings made a pawn out of me, and I blindly did everything they needed me to do. We don't know where the focal point is now. It could be anywhere in the world, and wherever it is, the horrors that wait beyond it are pleased. The Farallane will open. The peak Lilith spoke about may happen tomorrow, or not for years, but it will happen. The old things will come, and I am so sorry. Wow, 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 wow. Another one. Wow. Absolutely wonderful. What a tapestry of pure horror and mystery and time lapses and split dimensions. A bit of everything in that series. A big thank you once again to the awesome and incredibly talented author CreepyAus over on Reddit No Sleep. If you could smash an upvote and possibly leave a nice comment, it really helps them build their profile and presence on the Reddit app. Of course, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. Always on the lookout for brand new stories. And so if you have a story to share with us here on the show, please do get it over to myself at the usual email, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. And I look forward to hearing from you. As always, guys, I hope you had a fantastic and productive week, and family and friends and yourselves are well, and keeping fit and focused. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.